The Collector. Chapter 1. Arrival. Sarah Linden's weathered sedan crawled up the winding dirt road, headlights straining to pierce the late afternoon gloom that cloaked the forest. The GPS had fallen silent miles ago, its disembodied voice abandoning her to the mercies of the encroaching trees that loomed on either side like silent sentinels. The drumming of rain against the roof and the rhythmic swish of the wipers were the only sounds accompanying her on this final leg of the journey. She leaned forward, peering through the rain-streaked windshield for any sign of her destination. The lawyer's directions had been vague at best: a look for the faded blue mailbox, turn onto the overgrown path just past the lightning-scarred oak. It was like following a treasure map drawn by a drunk. Sarah had just about convinced herself she was well and truly lost when the path opened up and the cabin materialized out of the mist ahead. She eased her foot off the accelerator, the car lurching to a stop in what might generously be called a driveway. She sat for a long moment, wipers still swishing, engine grumbling, staring at the weathered structure that was now, for better or worse, her home. Her aunt's cabin. Dear old Aunt Mildred, whom Sarah had met maybe twice in her life, and yet in a fit of what could only be called morbid whimsy, had bequeathed this rotting box to Sarah in her will. A final joke from beyond the grave. Sarah couldn't begin to guess at the punchline. She and Mildred had been practically strangers, connected only by the thinnest thread of shared blood. But then, Mildred had always been a bit of an oddball herself, a recluse who'd retreated to this backwoods cabin decades ago and rarely emerged. Perhaps in her own twisted way, she'd seen a kindred spirit in Sarah. A fixer-upper for a life that needed fixing. The thought brought a right twist to Sarah's lips. Her life, her writing career, all of it felt about as solid as the sagging porch that fronted the cabin. She'd come here hoping to escape the wreckage, to finally dislodge the writer's block that had calcified around her for the past year. But now, confronted with the fading, fungus-gnawed reality of her so-called fresh start, she felt a chill of misgiving sleeting through her veins that had nothing to do with the damp. Her phone buzzed in the cup holder, making her flinch. It was Marcia, her agent, no doubt with yet another peppy pep talk, poorly masking the undertone of mounting desperation. Sarah silenced it without looking. Marcia could wait. The novel that refused to be written could wait. The porch steps groaned alarmingly as she heaved her suitcase up to the front door, nearly losing a heel through a gap in the warped boards. Everything about the place looked like it was one stiff breeze away from collapse. But the door swung open easily at her touch, unlocked. A gust of stale, musty air billowed out to greet her, tinged with a faint metallic tang that made her nose wrinkle. She fumbled along the wall, finding a light switch. A lone bulb sputtered to life, painting the narrow entry in a dim amber wash. Sarah stepped over the threshold, setting her suitcase down on the scarred hardwood floor. The space had the feeling of a time capsule, the furnishings and decor unchanged since the Reagan era. An old pine coat tree slumped against one wall, a few moth-eaten garments still hanging from its arms. An ornate mirror, in a tarnished brass frame, presided over a small side table, its surface obscured under a thick blanket of dust. But it was the room beyond the foyer that drew her eye, and the object proudly displayed within it like a showpiece. An old royal typewriter perched atop a spindly-legged table, its round black keys grinning at her from across the room, inviting her closer. Sarah moved as if drawn on a string, her footsteps muffled by the faded carpet. Up close, she could see the typewriter was ancient, a boxy battleship gray behemoth that looked like something out of a noir film. Its metal surfaces were dull, pitted with spots of corrosion, but the keys gleamed as if recently polished. She ran a finger along the top of the carriage, and it came away clean. No dust. A strange choice of decor for Aunt Mildred, who, as far as Sarah knew, had never written anything more creative than a grocery list. She wondered if it had been staged by the lawyer, a kitschy welcome gift for the niece with the stalled writing career. As if summoned by an occult power, words began to unspool in Sarah's mind. Her fingers twitched with a sudden urge to sit down in front of that typewriter and let them flow onto the page, to resurrect old dreams of crafting stories that would captivate and chill. Tales full of creeping dread and breath-snatching twists. But when she closed her eyes, all she saw was the empty glare of a blinking cursor mocking her from a sea of white. Sarah shook off the thought with an irritated huff. If she was going to get anything written, it wouldn't be on that relic. She turned away, resolving to haul the thing out to the garage in the morning. Maybe it could keep the mice company. She spent the next hours huttering around the cabin, half-heartedly unpacking. Outside, the rain tapered off and night unfurled like a bolt of black velvet. An owl began to call from somewhere deep in the woods, its mournful tones threading the air. The bedroom was at the back of the cabin, small and close. The mattress exhaled a mighty gust of dust when Sarah sat on its edge, but the linens seemed clean enough. She was just about to shed her clothes and burrow under the faded quilt when her gaze snagged on an object peeking out from under the bed. A book. Frowning, she crouched down and pulled it free. It was a thick, cloth-bound notebook, the kind with a black leather spine and marbled in papers. The pages within were yellowed with age and brittle under her fingers as she thumbed through them. Most were blank. But on the first page, in a spidery script that looked like it had been scratched with a nib pen, was a date. June 18, 1933. Beneath it, a single sentence. The first death is always the hardest. Sarah snapped the notebook shut, a sudden chill icing through her. For a long, motionless beat, she simply stared at the thing cradled in her hands, some primal instinct warning her to cast it away, to hurl it into the fireplace and watch it burn to ash. But, almost against her will, she found herself opening the cover once more, letting her gaze drift back to that ominous line. Morbid curiosity bubbled up to override the howling alarms in her brain. This was the stuff of stories, the kind of eerie detail that could jumpstart a thriller plot. Already, a dark tangle of what-ifs were unfurling in her imagination. What if this was a lost relic of some forgotten crime? An old, never-solved mystery, its clues moldering here between crumbling pages? What if Sarah herself, through some twisting of fate, was meant to unearth its secrets? It was absurd. The rational part of Sarah's mind knew that. It was far more likely the sentence was nothing more than an old dramatic flourish, penned by some long-ago occupant of the cabin overcome by a flight of morbid fancy. Just like the one skittering through Sarah's brain right now. With a huff of self-directed exasperation, she set the notebook down on the nightstand and crawled into bed. But as she closed her eyes, that one line seemed to hover behind them, burning itself into her brain. The first death is always the hardest. As Sarah drifted off to an uneasy sleep, she couldn't help but wonder. The hardest for whom? And how many had come after? Chapter 2. The Discovery. Morning light filtered weakly through grime-streaked windows, stirring Sarah from a fitful sleep on the lumpy couch. Fragments of the nightmares that had plagued her all night clung like cobwebs in the corners of her mind, disjointed images of shadowy figures and glistening blades. The echo of her own muffled screams seemed to linger in the musty air of the cabin. Groaning, she sat up and stretched, working out the kinks in her back. The ancient springs of the couch creaked in protest at the movement. Writer's block, an aching spine, and now dreams filled with B-movie cliches. If this was the fresh start Aunt Mildred's cabin had promised, Sarah wanted a refund. She stood, bare feet flinching at the touch of the cold hardwood floor, and shuffled to the kitchen. A few minutes of rummaging in the nearly barren cupboards yielded a dented tin of coffee and a chipped mug that may have once sported a cheerful pattern. Now it was faded beyond recognition, much like Sarah's initial optimism about this trip. As the coffee brewed, filling the small space with its rich, slightly burnt aroma, Sarah gazed out the kitchen window. The woods beyond were shrouded in a low-hanging mist, the skeletal outlines of trees fading into grayness. It was like looking at an unfinished painting, the artist having abandoned the canvas before bringing the scene fully to life. Needing a distraction from both the unsettling view and the nagging sense of unease that lingered from her nightmares, Sarah took her mug and began half-heartedly unpacking her meager belongings. In the bedroom, she tugged open a stubborn dresser drawer, stirring up a cloud of dust that danced in the weak light. The drawer yielded a few moth-eaten sweaters and a scattering of mouse droppings, but not much else. Sarah sighed, preparing to close it, but a flicker of curiosity made her run her hand along the upper edge of the drawer, just in case. Her fingers brushed something wedged behind it, a corner of something stiff and angular. Frowning, Sarah set down her mug and braced herself for another unpleasant wildlife discovery. Grasping the object, she pulled. It was a notebook. Battered black leather covers sandwiched a ragged sheaf of yellowed pages, like a slice of aged cheddar between two pieces of burnt toast. The silver clasp that held it closed had long ago lost its shine, leaving only a ghostly imprint of tarnish on the cover. Sarah held it gingerly, suddenly feeling like an intruder in her own temporary home. Mildred's home. But surely if the reclusive aunt had wanted to keep secrets, she wouldn't have bequeathed this place and all its contents to Sarah. The lawyer had been clearer. The cabin and everything in it was Sarah's now. Before she could second-guess herself further, Sarah carried the notebook to the kitchen table and flipped open the cover. It fell to the first page with a dry rustle, almost a sigh of resigned anticipation. The faded ink scrawled across the paper in an old-fashioned, spidery hand. June 18, 1958. Her body appeared on the morning of the summer solstice, pale and perfect on the forest floor, wreathed in wildflowers, arms folded just so across her chest. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading, the coffee cooling forgotten at her elbow. The notebook described, in chilling clinical detail, a young woman's murder. Violet Henderson, 24 years old, blonde and beautiful, found dead in a clearing in the woods behind the cabin. The passage went on to recount how the medical examiner determined she'd been sedated before having her throat cut with surgical precision, the blade slicing through skin and muscle and precious life like a key opening a lock. The hair on Sarah's arms rose, prickling against the fabric of her sweatshirt. It read like something from one of her own thrillers, from back when the words flowed easily, and the twists came to her like revelations. But this was real. A real woman, dead, reduced to words in a hidden journal like a butterfly pinned under glass. Seized by a sudden, inexplicable urge, Sarah flipped to the next entry. It was dated a month later and followed a disturbingly similar pattern. Another woman murdered, positioned like a macabre work of art in the forest on the night of the full moon. Delicate wildflowers woven into her dark hair in a mocking crown. With growing unease, Sarah skimmed the remaining entries spanning several years. In each, the story repeated with only minor variations. The victims' colored hair ribbons rippling in the breeze, black candles encircling the bodies, wax pooled and hardened in the dirt. Missing keepsakes, a locket, a ring, a scrap of clothing, taken as trophies. Sarah's hands were trembling by the time she reached the last page, the words blurring before her stinging eyes. Over a dozen murders, meticulously detailed from the 1950s through the early 1990s. The final entry, the shortest of all, sent a chill racing down her spine, settling in her gut like a ball of ice. She thinks it's over, that she's safe, that evil has gone dormant. She doesn't know that it's only resting, gathering strength for the next cycle. That once it starts again, it will be more terrible than ever before. It's coming for me now. I can feel it. The debt must be paid. I'm sorry, Sarah. The notebook slipped from Sarah's numb fingers and thudded to the scarred tabletop, the sound gunshot loud in the pressing silence. Questions spun in her mind, each darker than the last. What was this record of death, and why had Aunt Mildred kept it hidden all these years? An unnerving coincidence, those final words? Or a message from beyond the grave, a warning of horrors to come? Then Sarah remembered the news story that had caught her eye on the staticky radio as she drove into town the day before, the signal fading in and out as the winding road took her deeper into the mountains. A woman's body discovered in the woods, the first light of the solstice falling across her still form. Blonde hair fanned out in the dirt, a wreath of wildflowers in her folded hands. Sarah swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in her throat, tasting bitter coffee and rising fear. A shudder worked its way through her body as her eyes drifted back to that final line in the diary. I'm sorry, Sarah. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows, pale and impenetrable. And in the distance, barely audible over the pounding of her own heart, Sarah thought she heard something else. A whisper in the wind, threading through the trees. So, Sarah, time to pay the debt. Chapter 3. A Disturbing Connection. The rest of the day passed in a haze of restless pacing and disturbing hypotheticals. Sarah's mind churned, unable to shake the sick certainty that the woman found dead in the woods and the victims described in her aunt's cryptic journal were somehow connected. More than connected, that one had prefigured the other, a blueprint stretching across decades. It was insane. It was impossible. But once the idea had taken root, it burrowed deep, defying rationality. Sarah wandered through the cabin like a ghost, trailing her fingertips across the faded floral wallpaper, the moth-eaten curtains, the dust-laden bookshelves. Every creak of the floorboards under her feet, every rattle of the ancient windows in their frames seemed to whisper dark secrets. Secrets of the dead. Of her aunt's tormented scribbles in that tattered notebook, of the grim pattern repeating itself even now, decades later. She tried to lose herself in the mindless work of unpacking, of making some small effort to turn Aunt Mildred's time capsule of a home into a space that felt like her own. But her thoughts kept circling back to morbid speculation, her writer's imagination weaving vivid, gruesome scenes. The black satin ribbon in that poor murdered girl's hair. The shattered bones, the spilled blood. Death after death after death, penned in smudged ink on withered pages. Was it a confession? A twisted fantasy? Or something far more sinister? Sarah slammed a mug down on the counter, sloshing cold coffee across the chipped formica. She raked her hands through her hair, nails digging into her scalp. Several times she picked up her phone, thumb hovering over the keypad. She could call. Who? The police? And tell them what? That she'd found an old notebook filled with scrawled murder stories and had leapt to the mad conclusion that it somehow predicted the future. They'd laugh her off the line if they didn't have her committed on the spot. No, if there was a link to be uncovered here, a thread connecting the horrors of the past to the bloody headlines of the present, she'd have to unravel it herself. Sarah had spent the last decade plotting fictional crimes, devising ever more baroque and twisted scenarios to thrill her readers. Surely she could peel back the layers of a real mystery. She just needed more information. The next morning found Sarah hunched over a library computer, eyes gritty from lack of sleep, scrolling through digitized archives of the local paper. She'd hoped to find some mention of the cold cases from Mildred's journal, some confirmation that the nightmares in those pages had once been real. But the records proved frustratingly sparse. A few scant paragraphs about a tragic disappearance back in '73. A blurry photo of police cars clustered around yellow tape in an article from 1988, speculating about an alleged serial predator stalking the area. Crumbs and glimpses, whispers of what might have been. Nothing concrete. Dejected, Sarah pushed back from the desk, rubbing at her aching temples. The cloying smell of dust and moldering paper seemed to cling to her, following her out into the wan sunlight. On a whim, she detoured into the little diner on Main Street. The one she'd noticed was always crowded with gossiping locals. If there was any truth to the dark tales in her aunt's journal, surely someone in this close-knit community would remember. "You're Milla's niece, ain't you?" The gravelly voice startled Sarah out of her reverie. She looked up to see a hunched old woman peering at her over the rim of a chipped coffee mug, watery blue eyes sharp and assessing. "Heard you was staying up at the old cabin." "That's right," Sarah replied warily, sliding into the cracked vinyl booth. "I'm Sarah. Did you know my aunt well?" The woman let out a wheezing chuckle. "Well enough, Millie. She kept to herself mostly. But in a town like this, you get to know folks whether they like it or not." She stuck out a gnarled hand. "I'm Helen, been livin' in these parts nigh on 70 years now." Sarah shook the proffered hand, trying not to wince at the almost painful grip. 70 years, the woman would have been here for all of the alleged murders in Mildred's journal. Might even have known some of the victims. Choosing her words carefully, Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Helen, I wonder if you could help me with something. I found an old notebook of my aunt's, and in it, she wrote about some strange deaths that happened around here a long time ago." Helen's lined face seemed to shudder, her eyes going distant. For a long moment, she said nothing, just turning her coffee mug around and around in her twisted hands. Finally, she spoke, her voice a raspy whisper. "Your aunt, she always did have an interest in the darker side of things. Used to say she could sense it, the evil that lived in the shadows of this town." A chill traced its way down Sarah's spine. "What do you mean, evil?" Helen darted a glance around the diner, as if checking for eavesdroppers. When she continued, her voice was so low Sarah had to strain to hear it. "There's always been stories round here about girls going missing, turning up dead, stories that never quite made it into the papers, if you catch my meaning." Sarah's heart began to pound, a sick excitement unfurling in her gut. The journal mentioned names, dates: Mara Sinclair, 1973, Janie Larson, 1988. Were those girls real? Something flickered in the depths of Helen's faded eyes. Pity, perhaps. Or fear. Real as you and me, and they weren't the only ones. She pushed herself to her feet with a grunt, tossing a few crumpled bills on the table. "You'd best be careful, Missy, poking around in the past. There's some things that don't want to be remembered, some secrets that are better left buried." With those cryptic words, the old woman shuffled off, leaving Sarah alone with the racing of her own thoughts. Real. The victims in Mildred's journal had been real. Mara and Janie, and who knew how many others, lives cut brutally short. But why had her aunt known about the murders? Why document them in such chilling detail? What was the link? But the most chilling discovery came later that night, when Sarah finally worked up the nerve to delve deeper into the recent murder that had first sparked her awful suspicions. It took hours of combing through online forums and true crime blogs, but there it was, buried on a conspiracy theorist's website. Victim's name, Laura Bauer. Age, 26. Found posed in a forest clearing, blunt force trauma to the head. And there, in her long blonde hair, a black satin ribbon. Sarah's blood turned to ice in her veins. It was the same. The exact same grim details as the murders described in her aunt's journal decades earlier. The same macabre signature, the same brutalizing of female beauty. It couldn't be coincidence. It had to be connected. A killer plying the same vicious trade, separated by generations. Her aunt's faded words echoed in her head, taking on new and terrible meaning. It's only resting, gathering strength for the next cycle. Dear God, was that what this was? Some malevolent force, rising from dormancy every few decades to claim new victims in the same savage ritual. It was insane to even consider, like something out of Sarah's most far-fetched story concepts. She'd always prided herself on keeping her fiction rooted in the darkest recesses of the human psyche, not in flights of supernatural fancy. Real monsters wore human faces, had beating hearts blackened by hate and cruelty. They weren't phantoms conjured by hysterical imaginations. But now, with each uncanny detail Sarah uncovered, with each link in the chain between the cold cases of the past and the deepening mystery of the present, she could feel the ground of her staunch skepticism eroding beneath her feet. The boundary between the real and the impossible was beginning to blur, the fabric of reason fraying thread by thread. If there was some ancient pattern at work here, some cycle of vicious deaths repeating itself down through the ages, she couldn't dismiss the possibility any longer. Sarah's hands shook as she typed the detective's name into the search bar. Ben Carter. If the news reports were accurate, he'd been the lead investigator on Laura Bauer's murder case. And with nearly 3 decades under his belt in local law enforcement, there was a chance, however slim, that he might have knowledge of the older cases as well. The ones that seemed to have slipped through the cracks of official records. She hesitated only a moment before hitting send on the carefully worded email. Detective Carter was her best chance, maybe her only chance, of unraveling this mystery before it reached its grim conclusion yet again. Before the unknown killer struck once more, taking another life to complete his pattern, his ritual. Before the black ribbon fluttered once more against blood-stained golden hair. But even as a spark of grim hope flared to life in Sarah's chest, the cold fist of dread tightened its grip on her hammering heart. Because the pattern wasn't complete. Not yet. Mildred's journal whispered its warning across the decades, 3 murders, each a generation apart. And Laura Bauer was only the second. Somewhere out there, the monster was watching. Waiting. Selecting the canvas for his next work of art in this grotesque exhibition. The final sacrifice to seal this savage cycle. Unless Sarah could stop it. Unless she could untangle the threads of past and present and find the phantom puppet master pulling them taut. She'd spent her whole career crafting thrillers, devising the darkest and most diabolical crimes to ever grace the page. Now, she'd been plunged into a real-life mystery with the highest imaginable stakes. Because if Sarah couldn't unlock the secrets of her aunt's journal in time, if she couldn't uncover the identity of this killer before the pattern reached its brutal climax, the final victim could be someone she loved. It could be her. Sarah realized her hands were trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "Get a hold of yourself," she admonished inwardly. "This isn't one of your damn novels. You can't afford to fall apart now." She glanced at the clock, at the black rectangle of the uncurtained window. Almost midnight. Detective Carter likely wouldn't get her message until morning at the earliest. Nothing more she could do tonight. Though Sarah doubted very much that sleep would be forthcoming. With unsteady hands, she reached for the journal again, flipping through the yellowed pages, the faded ink. Searching for any detail she might have missed, any scrap of a clue to point the way forward. And trying very hard not to dwell on the nagging fear, the black certainty lurking at the edges of her mind. That even now eyes she couldn't see were fixed on her. That she'd entangled herself in a spider's web decades in the making. A web with the black satin ribbon woven through it, binding the victims, leading back to the silent spider at its heart. Waiting. Always waiting to complete the pattern anew. Sarah closed the notebook and hugged it to her chest. Outside the cabin's walls, the night pressed close, full of secretive rustles and nameless threats. Inside, the silence throbbed like a heartbeat, heavy with unanswered questions and the promise of fresh horrors to come. The hunt was on. But who was the hunter, and who the prey? Only time would tell. Time and death. Chapter 4. The Call Ignored. The morning dawned gray and bleak, the anemic light struggling to penetrate the forest's dense canopy. Sarah felt almost relieved bright sunshine would have felt like a mockery after the long night she'd spent tossing and turning, her dreams plagued with shadowy figures arranging pale bodies in pools of moonlight. She dragged herself out of bed, muscles aching from the tension that had gripped her even in restless sleep. In the harsh fluorescent glare of the bathroom mirror, the dark circles under her eyes stood out like bruises against her pallid skin. She splashed cold water on her face, trying to shock away the lingering tendrils of nightmare. The nightmares that had once been abstract, fuel for her stalled writing, now had faces. Violet Henderson. The names of the other women from Aunt Mildred's journal. Laura Bauer. Suddenly, penning grisly fictional murders felt perverse instead of darkly cathartic. How could she revel in staging imaginary crimes when real ones had played out so close to home? When they might still be playing out if Sarah's wild theory held water. She'd resolved to contact Detective Carter first thing, but now, in the sober light of day, Sarah found her conviction wavering. He'd probably hang up on her the second she started babbling about prophetic journals and ritual killings. Anyone would. And rightly so. It all sounded like the ravings of the paranoid, or the plot of a particularly tasteless pulp novel. Sarah paced the narrow confines of the kitchen, bare feet slapping against the chilly hardwood, as she argued with herself. No, the rational, responsible thing would be to turn the journal over to the police and let them decide if the stories within had any bearing on their current investigation. Sarah had no business trying to play amateur sleuth, no matter what her gut insisted. The shrill whistle of the tea kettle jolted her out of her spiraling thoughts. She busied herself preparing a mug, the familiar motions of steeping and stirring a momentary balm to her frayed nerves. Resolved to be sensible despite the gnawing uncertainty in her stomach, Sarah carried her tea to the small desk by the window and opened her laptop, determined to spend the day writing like she was supposed to. Like a normal person untouched by the specter of a decades-old murder spree. The blinking cursor on the stark white document mocked her, daring her to make sense of the jumbled horror show inside her head. The words came slowly, each one wrenched from the cauldron of dread that simmered beneath her skin. But they came. A few halting sentences swelled to a full page, the clacking of the keys a soothing metronome. Sarah lost herself in the familiar rhythms of crafting a scene, building mood and menace with careful strokes. She was just hitting her stride, fingers flying, and the outside world fading away, when a knock shattered her fragile focus. Sarah jolted upright, heart suddenly pounding. The cup at her elbow tipped, cold tea sloshing over her hand and onto the desk. She hardly noticed, every sense fixated on the sound that had no right to exist here, in her remote haven. Who would be at the door of her isolated cabin, unannounced? Mildred's lawyer. He had no reason to visit again now that the property had been signed over. A neighbor, perhaps, wanting to meet the reclusive old woman city mouse niece. Possible, but a quick peep out the window revealed an empty driveway. Whoever was at the door hadn't driven up. They'd approached on foot, materializing out of the misty woods like a phantom. Don't be ridiculous, Sarah scolded herself. It wasn't an axe murderer or Aunt Mildred's restless ghost. Probably just some local kid hawking magazine subscriptions or something. Still, Sarah found herself grabbing the heirloom rolling pin from the kitchen counter before she advanced down the hall to the door, holding it aloft like a club. Just in case. Who's there? Her voice sounded thin and reedy to her own ears, quickly swallowed by the oppressive silence that cloaked the cabin. No response came, not even the creak of a shifting floorboard. With a deep breath, Sarah pressed her eye to the peephole. The warped fisheye view showed an empty porch, bare of any lurking figure. She sagged with their relief, feeling foolish about her overreaction. Probably just a prank, local kids playing ding-dong ditch with the Nutty Rider lady. The sad thing was, Sarah couldn't even convince herself it was an absurd notion. That's how on edge the journal's revelations had left her. Shaking her head at her own skittishness, Sarah turned to trudge back to her desk and her never-ending battle with the blinking cursor, and caught her breath at the sight of a plain white envelope lying on the faded welcome mat. The hairs on the back of Sarah's neck rose. That hadn't been there when she answered. She was sure of it. Gingerly, as if the paper might scald her, Sarah bent and picked up the envelope with the hand, not still clutching the rolling pin. Her name was written across the front in blue ballpoint pen. Not the antique copperplate scrawl from Mildred's notebook of horrors, a modern hand, bold and almost aggressive in its slashes and angles. Sarah frowned at the unadorned rectangle, turning it over to find the flap simply tucked in, rather than sealed. No stamp or postmark. Hand delivered, then, by the vanishing knocker. Sarah weighed her options, the envelope heavy in her hand, despite its apparent emptiness. The sensible thing, the sane thing, would be to call the local sheriff's office and report the odd occurrence. Let them dust the envelope for prints or test for toxins or whatever it was they did. But even as the thought crossed her mind, Sarah knew she wouldn't do it. Whatever this was, it was personal. Another piece of the increasingly menacing puzzle that Aunt Mildred had left her. Sarah needed to see how it fit before she invited strangers to trample all over this deadly game board. Decision made, Sarah wrenched open the envelope with one decisive motion, and nearly dropped it when a faded brass key slid into her palm. It looked old, as ancient as the cottage itself, darkened with age and edged in verdant verdigris. Thoroughly unremarkable, and yet the sight of it made Sarah's stomach clench with inexplicable dread. Slowly she turned over the torn envelope, hoping for some clarifying note, some explanation. There was a single line typed on the interior flap, 1422 Blackwood Lane, hurry before it's too late. An address. The key must belong to whatever bolt hole or dungeon existed at that location. And the mysterious sender wanted Sarah to, what? Investigate? Uncover some dire secret before an unspecified, but no doubt gruesome deadline. It was like a plot twist from one of her own over-the-top novels. Sarah barked an uneasy laugh that echoed discordantly off the walls of the empty cabin. When she had prayed for inspiration, this wasn't exactly what she'd been envisioning. Against all logic and self-preservation, against the increasing intensity of alarm bells ringing in her skull, Sarah's hand closed around the key. The teeth bit into her palm, the metal still cold from its journey. Before it's too late, the message taunted. Too late for what? Or for whom? Laura Bauer was already dead. Was the killer even now selecting his next ritualistic victim? The thought spurred her feet into motion before her brain could countermand it. Sarah snatched up the keys to her car and headed for the door, Aunt Mildred's notebook of mysterious murders tucked beneath one arm and a strange brass key burning a hole in her pocket. Outside, the mist curled beckoning fingers around the trees, drawing her forward into its clammy embrace. She would get answers. She would stop this deadly pattern in its tracks, whatever it took. Even if it meant walking directly into the decades-old trap that had been waiting for her all along. Chapter 5. Crossing the Threshold. The address on the envelope was barely a 10-minute drive from Aunt Mildred's cabin, but it felt like an eternity to Sarah as she wove through the cloistered forest lanes, tires crunching on scattered gravel and dry pine needles. Part of her still couldn't quite believe what she was doing, if trespassing on a stranger's property, basing her actions on a series of increasingly disturbing and far-fetched coincidences. But another part of her, the part that had always been drawn to the dark and macabre, the part that made her such a successful thriller writer, felt an undeniable thrill at the prospect of unraveling this mystery. If it was real, if she wasn't just imagining connections where none existed, desperate for some excitement to jolt her out of her creative funk. The dense forest pressed in on either side, ancient oaks and maples with gnarled branches that seemed to reach out like skeletal fingers. Weak autumn sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting a sickly pall over the narrow lane. Sarah's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel as her mind reeled with the events of the past week, the gruesome murders, the eerie similarities to Aunt Mildred's morbid journal, the cryptic notes left for her to find. It was like something out of one of her own twisted novels, except this was all too real. "Get a grip, Lyndon," Sarah muttered as she hung a sharp left onto Blackwood Lane, the tires squealing in protest. "This is real life, not one of your hack novels. There's no such thing as ghosts or curses or any of that supernatural mumbo-jumbo." But even as the words left her mouth, Sarah felt a prickle of unease at the back of her neck, a cold sweat breaking out between her shoulder blades. The rational part of her brain knew that there had to be a logical explanation for all of this, a flesh-and-blood killer with a penchant for morbid theatricality, not some phantasmic boogeyman. But another part of her, the part that had always been attuned to the shadows at the edge of reason, couldn't shake the feeling that she was being drawn into something far more sinister than a simple murder case. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she pulled to a stop in front of 1422 Blackwood Lane. The house was, well, the only word for it was derelict. Paint flaked from the siding in great leprous sheets, the porch sagged on its foundations like a rotting jaw, and a few jagged shards of glass clung to the window frames like broken teeth. Overgrown weeds choked the yard, their pale tendrils clawing at the rusted remains of a chain-link fence. If Sarah had been scouting for a location to stage a horror movie, She couldn't have asked for better. She checked the address against the envelope one more time, as if the numbers might have magically transformed in the last 30 seconds. No such luck. This was the place, all right. The place someone, the same someone who had slipped that cryptic note under Aunt Mildred's door, wanted her to investigate. With a shaking hand, Sarah reached into her pocket and pulled out the ancient brass key that had come with the note. It was heavy and cold against her palm, its surface tarnished with age. She could still walk away, she told herself. She could still take this whole sordid affair to the police, let them sort out the tangled web that seemed to connect Laura Bauer's murder with Aunt Mildred's disturbing journal. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. But when had Sarah Linden ever done the smart or safe thing? She thought of all the hours she'd spent poring over Aunt Mildred's journal, trying to decipher the cryptic ramblings about the collector and his twisted rituals. She thought of the murders that had rocked this sleepy little town over the past few weeks, each one more horrific than the last. And she thought of the note that had drawn her here, to this decrepit old house on the edge of nowhere. Asterisk, I know what you're looking for, asterisk, it had said in spidery script. Asterisk, the answers you seek lie behind the door of 1422 Blackwood Lane. But be warned, once you cross this threshold, there is no turning back. Asterisk. Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs as she slid the key into the rusted lock, the tumblers giving way with a grating shriek. She half expected the door to be stuck fast, sealed shut by years of neglect and decay. But it swung open easily on surprisingly well-oiled hinges, revealing a yawning expanse of shadows beyond. She stood frozen on the threshold, one hand braced against the door frame as she peered into the gloom. One light filtered in through the grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust that swirled and eddied on the stagnant air. The foyer was choked with detritus, the moldering leaves blown in from outside, jagged splinters of wood from the rotting floorboards, a thick layer of dust and cobwebs that coated every surface like a shroud. But there was something else, too, a strange, sweet odor that hung cloyingly beneath the musty stench of abandonment. It reminded Sarah of overripe fruit left to wither on the vine, fetid and festering in the summer heat. The hair on her arms prickled as she breathed it in, bile rising in the back of her throat. "Hello," she called out, her voice echoing hollowly in the sepulchral silence. "Is anyone there?" There was no response, save for the skitter of tiny feet in the walls and the mournful creak of aged timbers shifting overhead. Sarah hesitated a moment longer, warring with herself. Every instinct screamed at her to turn around, to flee this God-forsaken place and the dark secrets it harbored. But she had come too far to turn back now. She had to see this through to the bitter end, no matter where it led her. Drawing in a shaky breath, Sarah fished her cell phone from her pocket and thumbed on the flashlight function. A stark blue-white beam sliced through the murk, throwing the ramshackle interior into sharp relief. She checked the screen reflexively. No service, of course. That would have been too easy. Steeling herself, Sarah crossed the threshold and ventured deeper into the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of dust. She shone her light into every nook and cranny, half expecting some grisly specter to come lunging out of the shadows. But there was nothing, just a sad tableau of moldering furniture and peeling wallpaper, the detritus of lives long since abandoned. The kitchen was a ruin of rusted appliances and warped formica, the cabinets sagging on their hinges like rotten teeth. In the living room, a moth-eaten sofa slumped beneath a film of grime, its upholstery patterned with ominous dark stains. Everywhere Sarah looked, she saw only ruin and neglect, No blood spatters, no arcane symbols scrawled in the dust. A small, irrational part of her felt almost disappointed. Then her beam fell on a door set into the far wall of the kitchen, its wooden planks warped and buckled with age. A rusted latch held it closed, the metal pitted and flaking. Sarah's heart lodged in her throat as she realized where it must lead, down into the dank bowels of the house. A root cellar, perhaps, or a basement. The kind of place where dark secrets and unspoken horrors lurk in thriller novels and in reality. Sarah's hand trembled as she reached for the latch, the metal icy against her feverish skin. Some primal instinct urged her to turn back, to flee this haunted house and never look back. But it was already too late. The mystery had its hooks in her now, dark and seductive and inexorable. She had to see it through, even if it destroyed her in the end. The latch gave way with a tortured shriek, the door yawning open to reveal a narrow flight of stairs plunging down into the gloom. Sarah aimed her phone down the cramped passage, the beam feeble against the pressing dark. A gust of frigid, mildewed air wafted up to meet her, reeking of decay and something even fouler, a gagging, sickly sweetness like rotting berries crushed underfoot. Sarah's legs trembled as she started down the stairs, one hand bracing against the crumbling wall. The boards groaned and shifted beneath her weight, decades of dust puffing up around her feet with each step. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped with a maddening metronomic regularity. The darkness closed in around her, thick and suffocating, until the feeble glow of her phone was the only light in the world. At the bottom of the stairs, Sarah found herself in a small, low-ceiling space, the walls running with damp and the floor little more than packed earth. The sickly sweet stench was overpowering here, clotting at the back of her throat until she gagged. She swept her light around in a jerky arc, her heart a wild bird in her chest. And then she saw it. Exactly what it was, she couldn't have said. A strange, twisted shape slumped against the far wall, glistening wetly in the narrow beam of her phone. It might have been a sack of moldering laundry, or a heap of spoiled meat. But some terrible certainty told Sarah that it was neither of those things. Some deep, reptilian instinct recognized the slick of blood, the protrusion of shattered bone, the sightless eyes staring up from my face, contorted in an eternal rictus of agony. Sarah's scream caught in her throat as she staggered back, her legs giving way beneath her. She fell hard, her phone flying from nerveless fingers to land with a crack on the packed earth. The light went out, plunging her into absolute blackness. And in that darkness, something stirred. It started as a wet, slithering sound, a terrible squelching like the stirring of maggots in putrid flesh. Sarah scrambled backwards on her hands and knees, her breath coming in ragged gasps. And then she felt it, a cold, clammy touch on her ankle, gripping with inhuman strength. She kicked out wildly, a sob tearing from her throat as her foot connected with something soft and yielding. The grip loosened, and she lunged to her feet, staggering blind through the cloying dark. Her shoulders slammed into the wall, and she rebounded, stumbling over the unseen obstacles littering the floor. Something snagged at her hair, ripping free with a sharp sting. The smell of decay was overwhelming, filling her nostrils and mouth until she retched. And still she ran, bouncing off the walls like a rat in a maze, desperate to escape the looming horror at her back. After an eternity, her groping hands found the stairs, and she hurled herself up them, ignoring the splinters that tore at her palms. She burst out into the kitchen in a blind panic, slamming the cellar door behind her. For a moment she just stood there, chest heaving, as she stared at the battered wood, half expecting it to bulge inward under the assault of some unspeakable thing. But there was only silence, thick and oppressive. With a shaking hand, Sarah fished her backup flashlight from her bag and clicked it on, not daring to retrieve her phone from the cellar floor. She had seen enough, more than enough. The image of that twisted shape in the darkness was seared into her mind's eye, an atrocity that would haunt her dreams for years to come. She didn't know what depraved mind could envision such horror, much less bring it to life. But one thing was certain: she had to get out of this house and out of this town before it was too late. Sarah stumbled through the decaying rooms in a daze, the beam of her flashlight jerking wildly. Her heart was a jackhammer in her chest, her breath rasping in her throat. She had to call the police, had to tell them what she had found. But would they believe her? Would they even care? Or would they just write her off as another hysteric, another burned-out writer chasing ghosts? She was almost to the front door when she heard it, a low, guttural moan that made the hairs on her neck stand on end. It was coming from the second floor, drifting down the stairs like a noxious vapor. Against her better judgment, Sarah aimed her light up the narrow staircase, dreading what fresh hell it might reveal. At first she saw nothing, just a landing choked with dust and shadow, the banister thick with cobwebs. Then a floorboard creaked overhead, and a figure shambled into view, little more than a silhouette against the murky light of the window behind it. It moved with a staggering, lurching gait as if drunk or wounded. Or something far worse. Sarah's mouth went dry as the figure started down the stairs, its footsteps heavy and uneven. She wanted to run, to scream, to do anything but stand there frozen like a rabbit in the headlights. But her limbs wouldn't obey, her voice trapped behind the blockage of fear in her throat. The figure drew closer, its face a pale blur in the darkness. And then the stench hit her like a physical blow. It was the same cloying reek she had smelled earlier, magnified 1,000-fold. The stench of death and decay, of putrefaction and unspeakable corruption. It clotted in her nostrils and coated her tongue, making her gag and retch. And still the figure advanced, one ponderous step at a time. Sarah finally found her voice as it reached the bottom of the stairs, a strangled croak that was swallowed by the tomb-like silence. She tried to brandish her flashlight like a weapon, but her hand shook so violently that the beam danced uselessly over the walls. The figure lurched closer, breathing in thick, liquid gasps. And then it spoke. "Hello, Sarah," it croaked, in a voice rusty with disuse. "I've been waiting for you." That was when she saw its face, or what was left of it. A grotesque patchwork of livid scars and oozing sores, the flesh sloughing away in great greasy runnels. Milky eyes stared out from sunken sockets, the irises clouded over with cataracts. Blackened lips peeled back from a maw bristling with shattered teeth, dark blood, and thicker things dribbling down its chin. Sarah's scream ripped through the fetid air like a gunshot as she whirled and ran, slamming through the front door and out into the chill autumn night. She sprinted down the weed-choked path, gravel scattering beneath her pounding feet. Behind her, she heard the shambling footsteps quicken, the thing's breath rattling in its ruined throat as it gave chase. She flung herself into her car and fumbled with the keys, panic making her fingers clumsy and numb. The engine coughed and sputtered as she twisted the ignition, dread a leaden weight in her gut. And then, blessedly, it roared to life. Sarah slammed it into gear and stomped on the gas, spitting gravel as the tires fought for purchase. The headlights flashed across a figure stumbling out of the overgrown yard, its gait lurching and unnatural. For a sickening instant, Sarah thought it would hurl itself into the path of her car. But then she was past it, fishtailing wildly as she careened back onto the narrow forest lane. Sarah risked a glance in the rearview mirror as she sped away, her heart a wild thing in her throat. The figure stood at the edge of the road, watching her flee with those clouded, sightless eyes. It raised one arm in a jerky salute, tattered flesh dangling from the yellowed bones of its hand. And then the darkness swallowed it, and it was gone. Sarah barely realized she was screaming as she tore through the black woods, the car bouncing and shuddering over the rutted lane. Tears streaked her cheeks, snot and spittle flying from her lips. She wanted to believe that it had all been a nightmare, a hallucination born of stress and too little sleep. But she knew better. The mystery had found her, just as she had feared. And now that she had crossed the threshold, there was no turning back. She was in this until the end, for better or worse. Even if it destroyed her. Even if heeding its call destroyed her in the end. Chapter 6. Initial Investigations. The stairs yielded no immediate horror, just an earthen-walled space crowded with moldering cardboard boxes, draped with cobwebs that shivered in the thin, wavering light of Sarah's phone-turned flashlight. Dust motes swirled lazily in the beam, dancing to the rhythm of her ragged breathing. The air hung heavy and stale, thick with the scent of damp soil and the musty perfume of decades-old paper slowly decaying. It was, by all appearances, a cellar as mundane as any other. No blood-spattered walls or ominous occult symbols etched into the packed earth floor. No rotting corpses propped in dark corners or grinning skulls perched on sagging wooden shelves. Just the detritus of an unremarkable life, packed away and forgotten beneath an isolated cabin in the woods. Part of Sarah, the part still subconsciously attuned to the ebb and flow of narrative tension, to the meticulous crafting of dramatic plot twists designed to make readers gasp and shudder, and felt almost disappointed at the anticlimax. That dark little voice in the back of her mind, the one that had spent countless late nights conjuring nightmares to splash across a page, practically pouted at the lack of macabre spectacle. Where was the chilling reveal? The stomach-churning confrontation with an unspeakable evil teased by the tattered notebook and its litany of ritualistic murders. But the larger, more rational core of her, the part not perpetually lost in lurid imagination and an overactive obsession with the darkest corners of the human psyche, sagged with guilty relief. No skeletons in this closet, literal or figurative. Just dust and junk and a vague sense of trespassing on the mundane remains of a lonely old woman's life. Time to click off the flashlight, trudge back up those creaking wooden steps, and leave the half-formed ghost stories rattling around her brain, safely on the page where they belonged. Resolved to shake off the irrational demons this strange quest had conjured, Sarah pivoted back towards the stairs, already anticipating the flood of late afternoon sunlight that would greet her as she emerged from this dank underworld. But as she turned, the wandering beam of her makeshift flashlight snagged on something half hidden in the murk. A glint of metal, winking back at her with a sickly white-blue gleam like some malevolent eye peering from the shadows. Frowning, Sarah swung her phone back around, tracking the feeble light along the cellar's earthen wall, and felt her breath catch in her chest, crystallizing into a cold, hard knot behind her breastbone. There, nearly obscured behind a haphazard stack of moldering books, was a metal shelving unit. The dull gleam of brushed steel seemed almost obscene amidst the organic decay, too sharp and modern for this sepulchral space. But it was what sat upon those shelves, neatly arranged like some museum display of the dam, that sent ice water cascading down Sarah's spine. A tarnished silver hairbrush, its ornate surface dulled by a patina of age and neglect. A single pearl earring, luminous even in the gloom, separated from its mate for who knows how many lonely decades. A squat black candle in a stained brass holder, its wick charred and brittle, reeking faintly of smoke and some cloying, unnameable spice when Sarah leaned in for a closer look. And, in the center, lovingly positioned like the star attraction in this grotesque collection, a coil of wispy blonde hair, so pale it seemed to glow with its own anemic light. The strands, fine and brittle as old cobwebs, were bound by a faded lavender ribbon, knotted with deliberate care. The oddments from Aunt Mildred's journal. The trophies taken from the scenes of unspeakable ritualistic crimes. Laid out like prizes from some unholy hunt, carefully curated and catalogued by the shadowy figure at the heart of the decades-old mystery Sarah had foolishly chosen to entangle herself in. By the monster the notebook called the collector. Sarah's hands shook so violently she nearly dropped her phone, and a light danced crazily across the cellar walls, distorting the shadows into leering, lurching shapes. This was undeniable proof that the horrors described in Mildred's cryptic pages were just the fevered dreams of a bored, morbid imagination. That a killer had been stalking this town, meticulous and monstrous in his grisly compulsion to claim keepsakes from the women he butchered. And that, after years of dormancy, he was active and hungry again, plucking his newest prize from the glassy, staring eyes of Laura Bauer's corpse splashed across the front page of the Ridge Creek Gazette. Suddenly, every shadow seemed to writhe with unseen menace, and that sweet, rotten scent intensified until bile stung the back of Sarah's throat and her empty stomach clenched in a dry heave. She reeled away from the shelves, phone clattering to the ground as she desperately tried to put distance between herself and those tainted objects, as if they could somehow infect her with the same twisted sickness that compelled their owner to such ritualistic atrocities. Sarah didn't realize she was running until her shoe caught on an uneven patch of ground and sent her sprawling face first onto the dank cellar floor. Pain exploded through her elbows and knees, and for a moment she just laid there, gasping, the image of that grotesque altar of artifacts seared into her mind's eye. Then, choking on a strangled sob, she pushed herself up on trembling arms and started to crawl towards the stairs, shattered phone forgotten behind her. She had to get out. Had to call the police, tell them what she'd found, before the shadows congealed into the collector's waiting hands, and the dusty air filled with the phantom scent of blood and smoke and decaying roses. "I see you got my invitation." That voice, low and rasping and horribly, impossibly familiar, turned Sarah's blood to sludge in her veins. Slowly, muscles locking with the resistance of rusted gears, she raised her head. Blinked once, twice, 3 times, willing the silhouette on the bottom cellar step to dissolve like just another shadow. But it remained, solid and substantial, the pale light from the kitchen above throwing its features into stark relief as it stepped forward with the soft deliberateness of a predator. And the face that leaned in close, twisted into a ghastly parody of a smile, was the one Sarah saw in her mirror every morning. Her doppelganger's eyes glittered like chips of obsidian in the gloom, fathomless and alive with a hellish glee. When it spoke again, the voice that echoed queerly back to Sarah in the clammy air was her own. "Hello, Sarah," it said. "I've been waiting for you." Chapter 7. The Skeptical Ally. Sarah burst through the front door, nearly tripping over her own feet in her haste to escape the nightmarish revelations of 1422 Blackwood Lane. Her heart pounded a frantic drumbeat against her ribs as she stumbled down the overgrown path, gravel crunching beneath her feet. The derelict house seemed to leer at her back in the sickly gray daylight, its windows like hollow eyes boring into her soul. None of it made sense. That macabre trophy room in the cellar, the impossible figure that wore her face like an obscene mask. But the animal instinct screaming in Sarah's brain drowned out all questions, all reason. Run. Get away. Don't look back. She fumbled in her pocket for a key fob, fingers slick with fierce sweat. The chirp of the locks unlatching was like a starting gun. Sarah wrenched open the door and flung herself into the driver's seat, slamming it shut behind her as if she could bar out the horrors clawing at her heels. The engine roared to life. Tires sprayed gravel like gunfire as Sarah peeled away from the curb. In the rearview mirror, the hulking silhouette of 1422 Blackwood dwindled and vanished, swallowed by skeletal trees. But the afterimage lingered, seared into her retinas. That, and the terrible grinning rictus of her own face in the gloom. Sarah's hands shook on the steering wheel, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was fading now, replaced by an icy trickle of dread. What was happening to her? Hallucinations, a psychotic break, some buried trauma exploding to the surface. Maybe Aunt Mildred's journal, with its litany of ritual and slaughter, had unhinged some deep Pandora's box in Sarah's subconscious, infected her with its madness. No. She couldn't start doubting her own senses, her sanity. Not now. There was a pattern here, a mystery crying out to be unraveled. The gruesome murder of Laura Bauer, the atrocities described in Mildred's crumbling pages, that chamber of horrors at Blackwood Lane, the tangled threads all led back to that damn key, slipped through her mail slot by an unknown hand. A breadcrumb trail into an unthinkable labyrinth. Sarah just had to keep it together long enough to see where it led, even if the end point filled her marrow with ice. But she couldn't walk this path alone, half blind, jumping at shadows. She needed a navigator, a voice of reason to anchor her before the undertow of paranoia dragged her under. She needed Detective Ben Carter. Decision crystallized. Sarah pulled into the police station parking lot. The crunch of gravel under her tires, a grim echo of her flight from Blackwood Lane. Her hands still trembled faintly as she killed the engine, but there was steel beneath the fear now. Purpose. The bullpen was a din of ringing phones and low chatter as Sarah navigated the sea of desks. A few curious glances lingered on her, but she ignored them, zeroing in on the lanky figure hunched over a stack of files. Detective Carter. Her lighthouse in the storm. He looked up as she approached, bushy brows drawn low over piercing eyes. Help you, miss? Sarah's mouth was dry as the journal's crumbling pages. She fought the urge to bolt. Detective Carter, I'm Sarah Linden. I need to talk to you about Laura Bauer's murder, and I think some others as well. Carter's frown deepened. He leaned back in his chair, an unyielding wall of authority. The Bauer case is an open investigation, you another reporter. I've already told you vultures. I'm not press, Sarah cut in. Her patience was fraying, the words boiling up like magma. I'm an author, true crime. I just inherited my aunt's cabin and I found something I think could break this whole thing wide open. The journal seemed to throb against her ribs, an occult heat bleeding through her shirt. Sarah drew it out with fingers that barely shook, laying it on the scarred wood of Carter's desk. The detective eyed it like a coiled snake. My aunt left me her journals. Records of murders going back decades, all with the same MO as Laura Bauer. Ritualized mutilation and display. It's a cycle, a signature, and I think the killer is active again. I think they might be coming for me next. God, saying it aloud, made it real somehow, crystallized the nightmare. Sarah's legs threatened to buckle. But she locked her knees, forced herself to meet Carter's gaze, and faltered at the sudden spark of recognition there, of grim resignation. "You'd better sit down, Miss Linden," he said heavily. It wasn't a request. "Start from the beginning, tell me everything." So Sarah did. The words poured out of her in a cathartic flood, finding Mildred's journal, the uncanny crime scene photos, that awful altar in the bowels of Blackwood Lane. Even her vision of that malevolent twin, though Carter's eyes shuddered at that, his expression impossible to read. When she finally ran dry, slumped numbly in her chair, the detective sat back with a slow sigh. He looked suddenly older, weary in a bone-deep way that had nothing to do with long hours or too much coffee. The look of a man who'd stared into the abyss too many times and felt it staring hungrily back. "I want to write this off," Carter said, each word heavy as a tombstone. "Kick it down to cold cases and call it a day. But I've been around the block too many times to ignore patterns like this. The late-night phone calls. The ones that make you sit bolt upright in bed at 4 a.m. He opened the journal almost gingerly, as if it might bite. A muscle jumped in his weathered jaw as his gaze flicked over the yellowed pages, the cramped, manic handwriting. "I always thought there was more to the Bauer case, whispers of something older, hungrier. But every time I pulled that thread, it crumbled in my hands." Carter shut the notebook with a papery snap, his gaze boring into Sarah like a drill bit. "If you're right about this, you're in a world of trouble, Miss Linden. This kind of evil, it's patient, meticulous. It'll watch and wait in the shadows for years until it can't hold back the hunger anymore, and when it finally comes for you." He didn't finish, but he didn't need to. Sarah could feel the knowledge, like a noose tightening around her throat, the terrible promise of that eyeless grin in the dark. This time her legs did give out. Sarah collapsed back into the chair, suddenly dizzy, the room graying at the edges. Carter's voice seemed to come from far away, muffled by the roar of blood in her ears. "Can't go home? Not until we know what we're dealing with. I've got a cot in the back, it's not much but..." "No." The refusal burst from Sarah's lips before she could stop it. The thought of being trapped here, caged, while that thing wore her face, violated her life. "No, I have to go back. The cabin, it's all I have left. I won't let him, take that too." She pushed herself upright, ignoring the black spots swirling across her vision. Carter was already rising, one hand half extended as if to catch her. Sarah waved him off. "I'll be careful, lock the doors, call you if anything seems off, but this is my life, my fight. I won't hide from it." The words sounded braver than she felt, but they kindled a flicker of something in her chest. Not hope, but determination. Defiance. Carter looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her face must have changed his mind. He sighed again, a short, sharp burst of resignation. "Against my better judgment, fine, but you call me at the first sign of trouble you hear. We're partners now, like it or not." Partners. The word settled oddly in Sarah's chest. An anchor, tethering her to solid ground as the world tilted on its axis. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice. Carter walked her to her car in silence, a solid presence at her shoulder. As she slid behind the wheel, he leaned in, his expression grave. "Evil like this, it's a sickness, a rot. It gets in your head, under your skin. Don't let it. Remember who you are, Sarah." what you're fighting for, and never, ever blink." Then he was gone, striding back towards the precinct, a lone figure backlit by the sinking sun. Sarah watched him go, her mind whirling. A killer obsessed with ritual and display, a cycle of violence echoing across decades. A journal full of secrets that could shatter her sanity. And at the center of it all, a house on a dead-end street, waiting to swallow her whole. As Sarah turned her car towards home and the falling dark, she could only pray that somewhere in the tangled threads lay an answer. A way to break the pattern before it broke her. Before the grinning thing in the shadows claimed its latest trophy. Chapter 8. Obsession Grows. The days fell into a strange, disjointed routine after that first harrowing meeting with Detective Carter. The police couldn't launch an active investigation out of mere suspicion and disturbing coincidences, not without more concrete evidence than a questionable old diary and Sarah's own increasingly fragile mental state. But Carter agreed to help her unofficially, to dig into the cold case files and see if any of the other murders meticulously documented in Mildred's faded journal had ever been reported or investigated. If they could find new leads, establish a pattern to the madness, maybe then Sarah would finally have a foundation to stand on. Something more tangible than shadows and the lingering residue of bad dreams. In the meantime, Sarah tried to return to some semblance of normalcy, despite the seething dread that gnawed at her bones. She went through the motions of being a struggling writer instead of a woman marked by a killer's deranged fixation. With trembling hands, she dusted off her laptop and cajoled her once vibrant muse to breathe life into words that felt brittle and hollow on the screen. The process was excruciating, each idea more forced than the last. But as vapid as the prose was, it still helped keep the tightness in Sarah's chest at bay. It gave her something to cling to as the steadily fraying tightrope of her sanity threatened to snap strand by strand. But even immersed in the blood-stained fictional worlds of her own making, Sarah couldn't escape the barbed hooks of the mystery that had ensnared her. In the suffocating silence of the remote cabin, she caught herself obsessively rereading passages from Mildred's journal, the pages soft and yielding beneath her desperate fingers. She scoured the cramped, spidery entries for any scrap of stray detail that might point to the identity seething behind the ritual murders. A turn of phrase, a cryptic reference. There had to be something. The victims had all been young women. That much was clear. Sarah traced their names with a ragged fingernail, lips moving in a silent incantation of grief. All of these lost girls had been killed with meticulous, almost surgical precision, their last moments saturated with unfathomable terror. And all had been made into grotesque effigies after death, their violated remains adorned and posed like macabre tributes to a ravenous god. The images seared themselves into the tattered wallpaper of Sarah's mind. What kind of soulless monster could commit such calculated atrocities? And, perhaps more disturbingly, why had he resurfaced now, decades later, to claim poor Laura Bauer as his own? To leave her splayed in a perverse echo of his previous handiwork, her dead eyes fixed on Sarah's own cabin in the woods. The unthinkable implications knotted themselves in Sarah's gut, a noose pulled tight. Somewhere in this godforsaken town, a remorseless killer walked free, and he'd purposefully drawn Sarah into his web. The questions consumed her, a rising riptide of terrible fascination, sucking at her every waking thought. Sarah stopped sleeping more than an hour or two a night, her vivid nightmares jolting her awake in a cold sweat. Food lost all appeal aside from the occasional handful of stale saltines that crumbled like old bones between her fingers. Gaunt and hollow-eyed, Sarah wandered from room to room in a haze of cigarette smoke and spiraling unease, Mildred's tattered notebooks never far from reach. They'd burrowed under her skin now, a poisonous splinter she couldn't dig out. She had to understand the pattern, had to uncover the rot behind the murders before she herself was woven into its terminal design. It didn't help that every shadow flickering across the rough-hewn walls seemed to ooze menace now, that every creak of a floorboard under her bare feet echoed like the phantom tread of an unseen intruder. That sickly sweet odor of decay Sarah had detected on her first day in the cabin clung to the musty corners with a choking insistence, a constant reminder of the grim trophies a monster had once hidden away. More than once, Sarah swore she caught a glimpse of sinister movement in her periphery when she sat hunched over the notebooks at the kitchen table, an unnatural silhouette that vanished when she jerked her head up to confront it head-on. And one particularly bad night, when the wind howled like a lost soul and the trees clawed at the windows, Sarah had felt the unmistakable weight of eyes on the back of her neck, boring into her from the darkest corner of the living room. But when she'd spun around, heart in her throat, there had been only suffocating blackness and her own ragged reflection staring back from the glass. She was unraveling inch by inch, the warped threads of her composure snapping under the strain of an unseen threat. But still she couldn't stop, even as the tiny rational voice left in her head screamed that she was tumbling headlong into madness. Not until she'd seen this mystery to its inexorable end. The notebook had chosen Sarah for a reason. She could feel it in the deadened thump of her own heart. For better or worse, the case was hers now. A deranged inheritance from a long-dead woman. And so Sarah soldiered on in her isolated bastion, burying herself in the kill-stained pages and the gruesome crime scene photos Detective Carter begrudgingly shared over countless cups of bitter coffee. He was her sole lifeline to the rational world, the only star in her increasingly clouded sky. Carter checked in on her daily, ostensibly to update her on his off-the-books investigation, but Sarah suspected it was more to reassure himself that she hadn't completely lost her mind. Or worse, become the collector's next lovingly posed masterpiece. "Jesus, Lyndon, you look like hammered shit," Carter told her bluntly one grim afternoon, his weather-beaten face pinched with concern as he took in her gaunt cheeks and wild, bloodshot eyes. A dozen photographs and news clippings were pinned haphazardly to the wall behind her, linked by strands of red string like a spider's web of death. "When's the last time you got any sleep, ate something that wasn't 90% preservatives?" Sarah waved him off with a nicotine-stained hand, her attention still fixated on the macabre collage. The glossy photos of mutilated women stared back at her in eerie silence, their dead eyes pleading for a justice long denied. "I'll rest when I'm dead," she muttered darkly. "Maybe not even then, if our collector friend has his way." Carter sighed, the sound heavy as a stone in the stagnant air. He eased himself onto the armchair across from Sarah, his broad shoulders hunched under the ugly floral upholstery. "If you self-destruct before we catch this guy, you're no good to anybody," he reasoned. "From what you've told me, Mildred was." "Crazy?" Sarah's bitter laugh scraped her raw throat. She fished another cigarette from the battered pack in her cardigan pocket and sparked it with trembling fingers. "Yeah, that's the understatement of the fucking century. Dear old Auntie Mildred was nuttier than a fruitcake, fat lot of good that does me now. I'm just saying, she wouldn't want you to lose yourself to this, to him." Carter's craggy features tensed, a muscle jumping in his unshaven jaw. Sarah knew he was trying to pull her back from the yawning abyss of obsession before it swallowed her whole. But it was far too late for that. The darkness already had her by the throat. She stood abruptly, sending her rickety chair skidding back with a screech. A plume of blue smoke twisted from her lips as she wheeled on the startled detective, a sudden surge of directionless fury boiling through her veins. She's dead, Ben. Mildred's dead. And she was crazy. And none of that changes the fact that we have a deranged serial killer using my new hometown as his own personal murder playground. So maybe you should be less worried about my mental state and more focused on the collector's next target. You think I don't want to nail this psycho to the wall? Carter surged to his feet, a vein pulsing at his graying temple. For a moment, Sarah thought he might shake her. There hasn't been a single day in the last 15 years that I haven't dreamed about slapping the cuffs on the monster responsible for this. He gestured sharply at the gruesome gallery Sarah had erected, his mouth pressed into a grim line. You aren't the only one with skin in the game, Sarah. One of those girls up there. She was my sister-in-law, my wife's baby sister. His voice cracked on the last word, a hairline fracture in his stony composure. I want the collector, believe me, but I'm telling you, as a friend, don't let him take you too. You go down that road. Let it eat you up inside, and he wins even if we catch him. The fight abruptly drained out of Sarah at the detective's raw confession, leaving her dizzy and slightly sick. She slumped back into her chair, one hand scrubbing at her scalding eyes. I'm sorry, she rasped after a long, heavy beat. I didn't know. Carter waved off her apology, his own anger banked to a simmer. I don't exactly advertise it, Liz. She took Maggie's death real hard. I thought it would break her. Guess I've been trying to put it all behind me for her sake. He dropped back into his own seat with a weary exhalation, scrubbing a hand over his stubbled face. Just promise me you'll take a step back if you feel yourself going to that dark place, all right? Come up for air now and then. I've lost too many people to this case already. Despite herself, Sarah felt something loosen infinitesimally in her chest. It wasn't hope exactly, but it was akin to it. The knowledge that she wasn't screaming her truth into a void after all. That someone else believed in the evil stalking Blackwood's sleepy streets and was determined to drag it kicking into the light. I'll try, she said finally, the words thick on her tongue. But I can't stop, Ben, not until we put this bastard in the ground. The collector chose me for a reason, and I need to know what it is. Carter held her gaze for a long, searching moment. Whatever he saw in her hollowed eyes must have satisfied him, because he reached out and covered her ice-cold hand with his own warm, calloused fingers. A lifeline thrown into the darkness. All right, he said quietly. All right, but we do this smart, you hear me, by the book as much as we can. You're not alone in this anymore, Sarah. Remember that. She managed a nod, not trusting her voice. It was the closest to peace she'd felt since the nightmare began. Like a tiny ember of clarity in the howling maelstrom of her mind. She clung to it with everything she had left as Carter took his leave, and the shadows crept back in. Tomorrow, perhaps, the work would begin in earnest. The slow, painstaking work of justice. A vengeance decades overdue. But tonight, Blackwood held its breath. Tonight, for a few precious hours, the collector of lost souls lay quiet in his hidden lair, dreaming his death-glutted dreams. And Sarah was content to wait a little longer for the reckoning, for the truth. It would all come down to blood in the end. She could feel the promise of it, vibrating in the marrow of her bones. Someone was going to bleed before this was through. She just prayed it wouldn't be her. Not this time. Chapter 9. Decoding the Logic. Energized by Carter's steadfast support and determined to reclaim some sense of control, Sarah threw herself into analyzing the collector's deranged methods with renewed fervor. If she couldn't stop the nightmares or banish the specter of her own doubled face, she could at least try to deconstruct the killer's twisted logic. To predict his next strike, and derail this railcar to hell before it dragged her under its wheels. She retreated to the musty seclusion of her aunt's study, the air thick with the scent of old paper and faded ink. The room felt simultaneously like a sanctuary and a tomb, a fitting stage for her morbid undertaking. Mildred's notebooks were piled haphazardly on the desk, their battered covers bearing silent witness to the atrocities inscribed within. Sarah picked up the topmost volume, its spine cracked, and its pages brittle with age. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, then flipped it open and began to read. The words seemed to writhe on the page, the looping script of her aunt's hand describing murder after ritualistic murder in the dispassionate tone of an anthropologist or a coroner. A pattern quickly emerged, as stark and ugly as a bloodstain. Each of the recorded killings occurred on a new moon when the night was at its darkest, as if the perpetrator needed the cover of utter blackness to carry out his grim work. The victims were all women in their 20s with pale hair and blue eyes, their bodies displayed at sites of supposed occult significance. Crossroads, fairy mounds, ancient standing stones. Like grotesque offerings to some unspeakable god. Sarah's fingers tightened on the fragile pages as a terrible suspicion began to take root in her mind. Was the collector weaving his atrocities into the very ley lines of the land, stitching horror into history, binding his deeds to the dark energy that pulsed beneath the surface of things, waiting to be tapped by those foolish or depraved enough to try? She pushed the thought away, nausea rising in her throat. Focus on the facts, Lyndon. Cold, hard data. The devil is in the details. And the details were damning enough. Always, the killer took the same grim keepsakes from his victims. A lock of hair, a scrap of clothing, a talisman of essence to be preserved in his twisted collection. It was those trophies that haunted Sarah the most, a physical proof that these women, these daughters and sisters and friends, had been reduced to mere objects. Stripped of life, of humanity, to fuel a madman's need to possess and desecrate. "You sick bastard," she whispered, glaring at the notebooks as if she could incinerate them with the heat of her gaze. "I'll see you rot in hell for this." But first she had to find him. Had to untangle the knot of his diseased logic and use it to string him up. Sarah turned back to the faded pages, forcing herself to keep digging through the muck. There had to be some key, some cipher to his methodology beyond moon phases and victim profiles. Some clue to crack the code of his obsession. Hours slid by in a haze of grim concentration, the afternoon sun sinking into a bloody smear on the horizon. Sarah barely noticed the changing light, lost in a labyrinth of ancient history and occult lore as she tried to parse the killer's arcane signature. It wasn't until her stomach growled plaintively, reminding her she hadn't eaten since dawn, that she finally resurfaced. Scrubbing a hand across her gritty eyes, Sarah stood and stretched, wincing as her joints popped in protest. She needed food, coffee, a break from the madness before it consumed her utterly. Before she started to wonder if the scene outside the window, the lengthening shadows, the skeletal trees clawing at the darkening sky, was real or just another projection of her fracturing psyche. Sarah was halfway to the kitchen when a stray scrap of memory snagged at her thoughts, halting her in her tracks. That footnote in the newspaper archive, the bare bones of a story that her aunt had apparently missed or omitted. With rising excitement, she hurried back to the study and began rummaging through the stacks of yellowed newsprint. There. The article was dated November 1st, 1963, detailing the gruesome discovery of a woman's mutilated body near the standing stones at the edge of town. Molly Dayton, age 24, hair like corn silk and eyes like a clear spring sky. Killed and posed in the collector's signature style, a sacrificial offering to some hungry god. Just like the first murder recorded in Mildred's journal. The catalyst kill that had started the dominoes of death, hoppling down through the decades. But this article contained one crucial detail Sarah's aunt had left out. Molly Dayton had vanished on October 31st, Halloween, Samhain, the ancient Celtic festival when the veil between worlds grew thin as gauze. When the dead walked and the fairy folk swarmed from their hollow hills to work mischief and terror. When the old gods, the cruel gods, drank deep of blood and fear. Sarah's heart stuttered behind her ribs as the pieces fell into place with a terrible, inexorable click. The collector wasn't just timing his kills to the new moons. He was orchestrating them according to a darker calendar, pegging his atrocities to the major Sabbats and high unholy days. Staging his grim rituals as acts of worship and supplication, offerings to slake the thirst of the restless dead and the ravenous gods. But why? What did he hope to gain from this obscene veneration? Power, immortality, the favor of forces beyond mortal ken? Or was it simpler than that, a way to satisfy his own hellish urges, to cloak his sick compulsions in a shroud of eldritch mystique? Sarah wasn't sure which possibility disturbed her more. A shudder rippled through her, gooseflesh prickling along her arms despite the close heat of the study. She felt dizzy suddenly, unmoored, as if the walls were dissolving around her and the shadows pressing closer. As if the notebook's tales of blood and ruin were leaking from the page, infecting her reality like drops of poison in a well. Easy, Lyndon. Don't lose the plot now. She closed her eyes, sucking in a deep, steadying breath. When she opened them again, the room had resolidified, returned to its shabby, unthreatening familiarity. But the unease lingered, coiled cold and queasy in her gut. Her gaze fell on the final entry in Mildred's last notebook, the cryptic farewell message that had been haunting the edges of her thoughts. "It's coming for me now," her aunt had written, the usually neat lines of her handwriting ragged with haste or fear. The debt must be paid. A terrible suspicion began to germinate in the back of Sarah's mind, fed by exhaustion and paranoia and the phantom weight of her doppelganger's smile. What if the collector's killings weren't just random acts of madness, but installments in a longer game? A tithe owed to some unspeakable entity, a quota of atrocity that had to be met lest the piper come calling for his due. And what if Mildred, oblivious or complicit, had somehow entangled Sarah in this devil's bargain, made her the latest link in a chain of suffering that stretched back generations, a cursed legacy handed down like a cancer through the family line? The implications crashed over Sarah in a black wave, dragging her down into the depths of despair. Was this her fate, her inexorable destiny? To be collected, catalogued, made into an exhibit in the museum of a monster's compulsions? To have her life, her very soul, tithed to the dark to appease a ravenous god? "No," she said out loud, her voice raw and ragged in the oppressive hush of the study. "I won't let it happen. I won't be made into a goddamn victim." She was a fighter, a survivor. She'd beaten the odds before, and she would again, even if she had to claw her way out of the abyss with her fingernails. The collector had chosen the wrong final girl to tangle with. Sarah would see this pattern broken, this story ended, if she had to drag them all into hell to do it. Her jaw tightened with grim resolve as she squared her shoulders and turned back to the notebooks, to the bloody breadcrumb trail of atrocities that would lead her to the monster at the end of the tale. She had work to do, and God help anything that tried to stand in her way. Chapter 10. The Threat Emerges. The musty odor of decaying paper and ancient leather bindings filled Sarah's nostrils as she hunched over the old tomes scattered across the creaky wooden table. The dim light of the kerosene lamp flickered, casting a feeble orange glow over the lunar calendars, town maps, and volumes on Celtic folklore strewn before her. Across the table, Detective Carter rubbed his bloodshot eyes, the lines etched deep into his weathered face a testament to the long hours they'd spent trying to divine the mad algebra of the collector's methodology. "The new moon closest to Samhain is only weeks away," Sarah muttered, her voice hoarse from lack of sleep and too much strong black coffee. She jabbed a finger at the calendar, the bitten nails and chapped skin a mark of her growing obsession. "If this lunatic keeps to his pattern, if my hunch is right, that means some poor girl's hours are numbered." Carter grunted in assent, his gaze distant, no doubt seeing the faces of the collector's previous victims. Young women, all of them, barely more than girls really. Blue-eyed and fair-haired, their pale faces forever frozen in the rictus of terror, grinning skulls wreathed in golden tresses. "We'll find her," he said, but there was a hollow note to his gravelly voice, an uncertainty that belied his words. "We'll warn her, put her in protective custody if we have to. This bastard won't claim another one." Sarah wanted to believe him, wanted to cling to the steadfast conviction in his tone. But the doubts that had germinated like poisonous weeds in the dark corners of her mind refused to be uprooted so easily. As the days ticked down, and the hunter's moon waned to a sliver in the October sky, a new and terrifying possibility began to take shape, a grotesque bud unfurling blood-red petals in the twisted garden of her imagination. The collector's victims all shared certain characteristics, yes. But what if the specific timing, the ritual precision of his kills, was less important than the overarching narrative they etched in entrails and agony? What if, as Aunt Mildred's final message had hinted with such chilling audacity, Sarah herself was the intended endgame? The culmination of 8 plot generations in the making, a debt come horrifically due on the cusp of Samhain. She fit the profile after all. Young enough, if you squinted and ignored the crow's feet feathering her eyes, the threads of silver glinting among the gold. Blue-eyed and fair, the all-American girl gone to seed in the backwoods of Oregon. A writer, a weaver of stories, just like dear Aunt Mildred. A reclusive old bat who'd retreated to this moldering cabin to spin her tales in solitude. And hadn't the collector already left his calling cards at Sarah's door, macabre love notes in the form of cryptic journals and tarnished keys? Hadn't some spectral version of herself smiled back at her from the depths of the Blackwood basement, all too eager to serve as the vessel for whatever dark consummation the killer had planned? Sarah shuddered, her fingers unconsciously brushing over the outline of the strange brass key she now carried with her everywhere, a talisman against the creeping certainty of her own damnation. At night she triple-checked the locks, wedged a chair under the doorknob, and lay awake staring at the water-stained ceiling, trying not to flinch at every groan and sigh of the arthritic timbers. When sleep did come, in fitful snatches, it was shallow and plagued by phantasmagorias of grinning shadows and bone-white forms frolicking in moonlit glades. Detective Carter, bless his stubborn hide, had not dismissed her growing paranoia out of hand when she'd finally given it voice. He insisted on regular check-ins, on driving by the cabin at odd hours, just to make sure Sarah's battered old Jeep was still parked out front, that the yellow lamplight still spilled from between the gap-toothed curtains. If this was a trap, and she the bait, then he would be her safety net, the tripwire between the collector and his prize. "I've failed too many," he'd said one rainy night, his face a craggy mask in the glow of the dashboard lights. "Too many girls who should have had their whole lives ahead of them. Not this time, you hear me, Lyndon? This one doesn't get away." Sarah was grateful for Carter's gruff concern, for the anchor of his belief in a world unmoored. But deep in the marrow of her bones, she knew that when the time came, when the blood-smeared mosaic of the collector's design reached its terrible zenith, she would face him alone. This was her story, her curse and her legacy. She would see it through to whatever end awaited her, no matter how dark the chapter or dear the price. October dragged on, the slanting light crisping to beaten gold as the leaves withered and fell in droves, piling up against porch and fence post like drifts of faded confetti. Sarah watched the moon wax and wane, a pale, unblinking eye peering down through the skeletal latticework of branches. She watched the shadows stretch and deepen, the boundaries between worlds worn gossamer thin as Samhain approached. And she watched the calendar, each X marking another sunset, another day closer to the night when the dead walked and the collector came to claim his due. On the eve of the new moon, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, the harsh trill of the ringtone shattering the sepulchral silence of the cabin. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her fingers clumsy and numb as she swiped to reveal a single image, grainy and dim in the guttering glow of the cracked screen. It was the Blackwood house. The same sagging porch, the same weathered siding the gray of old bones. But there, slung over the porch railing like a discarded doll, was the unmistakable shape of a body. A woman's body, slack and boneless, blonde hair fanning out in a tangled aureole. The phone slipped from Sarah's fingers, clattering on the scarred floorboards. Bile scorched the back of her throat, sour and acidic, a drowning tide of horror and realization. It was her. She knew it with a dull, leaden certainty that settled in her guts like a stone. The collector had made his move at last, painted his tribute in skin and hair and ruined viscera. A gallows promise, left to rot on Mildred's porch. A message and an invitation Sarah couldn't refuse. Not if she wanted this to end, once and for all. Not if she wanted to look her own reflection in the eye ever again. Sarah took a deep, shuddering breath, air rattling in her lungs like old pennies in a beggar's cup. She fumbled for the phone, the brass key grasped tight in her other fist, its edges biting into soft flesh. Time to accept the invitation. Time to finish this story she never asked to be a part of. She hit Carter's number on speed dial, listening to it ring once, twice. On the third ring, she hung up, unplugged the phone, and let it fall. No more safety nets. No more bystanders to bleed in her stead. The key was cold against her palm, an unforgiving weight, the haft sticky with blood where the teeth had pierced her skin. Sarah closed her fingers around it, feeling the shape of it, the hum and thrum of old dark magics. Her lips peeled back from her teeth in a feral grin, a rictus of defiance and despair. "All right then, you sick son of a bitch," she whispered into the waiting dark, to the pale, pitted face of the moon. "Let's finish it." Chapter 11. Isolation and Paranoia. The world compressed to a single imperative, a strobe flare of desperation pulsing behind Sarah's eyes. Get to Blackwood. Don't call Carter, don't call for backup. She couldn't risk it, couldn't let this play out with anyone else in the crosshairs. It was her move in this fatal chess game, her twisted fairy tale logic problem. The final girl, alone in the dark with the monster. Sarah's Jeep careened down the rain-slick roads, tires throwing up fantails of autumn leaves that swirled in its wake like a pack of hounds baying at her heels. The windshield wipers battled in vain against the driving sheets of water, leaving her vision distorted and fragmented. Sarah's knuckles were bloodless on the wheel, her lips moving in some soundless litany of defiance or prayer. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before her, a ribbon serpent winding through the nightmarish landscape. At last, she skidded to a shuddering stop in front of 1422 Blackwood Lane, heart jackhammering behind her ribs. The house loomed before her, every bit as lifeless and foreboding as that grainy cell phone image had promised. Shadows clung to its weathered clapboards like grasping fingers, and the overgrown yard was strewn with the litter of decades, or rusting metal, shattered glass, forgotten remnants of past lives. A charnel temple, steeped in secrets and sacrifices. Sarah inhaled a shaky breath, steeling herself. The porch railing was bare. No blonde effigy splayed across it like a discarded rag doll. No sign of the collector's grim handiwork at all. Had she hallucinated it, spun it out of the gossamer strands of her unraveling mind? Was this whole deadly scavenger hunt nothing more than a psychotic episode, the product of an overtaxed psyche gorged on true crime and ancestral guilt? Or had she simply arrived too late, missed her chance to stop this cycle of atrocity in its tracks? Only one way to know for sure. Fingers trembling, Sarah retrieved the old brass key from her pocket and slid it into the lock. The door creaked open on a waft of stale air and mildew, the same atmosphere of suspended decay that had greeted her on her first visit. She crossed the threshold with leaden feet, cell phone raised to throw its thin blue beam into the waiting dark. Hello, is anyone there? Silence, thick and absolute as a burial shroud. The house seemed to swallow her voice, to drink down the wavering light without a trace. Sarah took another step, then another, her breathing shallow and fast in her ears. From upstairs came the soft, deliberate creak of a floorboard. A muffled thump, as of something heavy being dragged across ancient wood. Sarah's heart stalled, then kicked into panicked overdrive. He was here. The collector, lying in wait amid the moldering lace curtains and curling wallpaper of this vile mausoleum. Hungry for his prize, for the culmination of his great and terrible work. She should run. Should flee this place and never look back, Carter and the cavalry and the whole benighted town be damned. But Sarah was so tired of running, so tired of letting this twisted skein of destiny jerk her along like a puppet on a string. If this was to be her final chapter, she would meet it head-on. Would see her monster plain before the end. One step at a time, she mounted the groaning staircase. Up, into the suspended miasma of decades, into the hushed and waiting darkness. Her progress was agonized, each footfall an eternity, but Sarah barely felt the burn in her thighs or the ice water fear trickling down her spine. All her being was focused upward, toward the landing, toward the squeal of hinges and the shuffle thump of something massive moving just beyond her sight. At last she reached the top, chest heaving and mouth dust dry. And there, at the end of the gloomy hallway, a door stood ajar. Thin ribbons of buttery light spilled through the crack, painting the warped floorboards with shadows like grasping fingers. An invitation. A gilded cage, its door swung wide. Sarah already knew what she would find on the other side. Knew it with every fiber of her screaming nerves, every synapse firing distress flares through her skull. But still she pressed forward, a woman mesmerized, an animal caught in the twin jaws of terror and morbid compulsion. She had to know, had to see, even if it destroyed her. The door creaked open at the barest pressure from her fingertips, silent on its ancient hinges. And the scene that greeted Sarah drove the breath from her lungs in a wounded rush, as if she'd been punched in the solar plexus. Candles. Dozens of them, perched on every flat surface in eerie ranks and files. fat pillars of wax that cast a sepulchral glow over the scene of carefully curated horror laid out like an artist's tableau. The flickering light danced across the cracked plaster walls, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to sway and writhe with a life of their own. In the center of the room, blonde hair fanning across a rotted counterpane in a mocking halo, lay the body of a young woman. Her glassy eyes stared sightlessly at the cobweb ceiling, lips parted around a final, soundless scream. Cuts and gashes marred her porcelain skin, a gruesome stigmata that wept dark rivulets down her bare limbs. And at her throat, like a perverse choker, a braided lock of corn silk hair tied with a lavender ribbon. Sarah's gorge rose, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle the sob that clawed its way up her gullet. She was too late. The collector had claimed his prize, had sealed this chapter of his magnum opus in gore and desecration. And Sarah was to be the final footnote, the authorial cameo penned in her own heart's blood. She staggered back, shoulder blades slamming into the door frame. Get out! She had to get out, had to flee this charnel pit of madness before. Hello, Sarah. That voice, soft and rasping in the burnt umber gloom. A voice Sarah knew in the deep reptile recesses of her brain. The same voice that had whispered through her nightmares, that had coiled like a noose around her pounding heart. Slowly, every nerve shrieking with the need to bowl, Sarah dragged her gaze away from the dead girl on the bed. Up, to the figure standing motionless in the corner. A figure that stepped forward into the guttering half-light of the candles, pale face split in a smile that was all teeth and red lips. I've been waiting for you, the collector said. It was Sarah's own face that stared back from behind those fathomless black eyes, her own hands that lifted, tacky with drying blood. Chapter 12. The False Victory. Sarah's mind reeled, the room spinning around her in a sickening whirl. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But no matter how many times she blinked, how hard she dug her nails into her palms, the nightmare vision persisted. Her own double, grinning back at her, with a mad light dancing behind its eyes. The cloying scent of decay hung thick in the air, mingling with the coppery tang of fresh blood. Dozens of candles sputtered in the draft from the open door, casting distorted shadows that crawled across the rough-hewn walls. What are you? Sarah's voice emerged strangled, barely recognizable to her own ears. Her heart hammered against her ribcage like a caged animal fighting for escape. This isn't real. You're not real. The other Sarah threw back its head and laughed, a sound like shattering glass. Oh, I'm very real. It stalked closer with a predator's grace, head tilting like a bird of prey sighting wounded game. Viscous crimson dripped from its fingers, leaving a gruesome trail across the dusty floorboards. As real as you are, more perhaps after all, I'm the one who's been pulling the strings all along. No, this is insane. Sarah shook her head frantically, greasy strands of hair whipping across her ashen face. She desperately wanted to run, to scream, but icy terror had locked her joints, fear's rigor mortis setting in. You're a hallucination, a manifestation of my subconscious. I've been under so much stress, I haven't been sleeping. Still in denial, even now? The doppelganger clicked its tongue, a grotesque parody of a chiding mother. It was close enough now that Sarah could feel the icy puff of its breath, could smell the rank fetor rising from its gore-streaked skin. Poor little Sarah, so desperate to cling to your fraying threads of reason. One corpse-cold finger swiped down the curve of Sarah's cheek. She recoiled with a strangled yelp, stomach clenching as bile scorched the back of her throat. The touch was real, damningly real, a no ethereal brush of ghostly digits but solid, probing flesh. "I'm not some fleeting phantasm, dearest. I'm the truth you've been chasing all along, the shadow cast by the light of your so-called logic." But the journals, the ritual murders. Sarah cast a wild glance at the atrocity sprawled across the bed, fighting down a fresh surge of nausea. It was Laura Bauer, no mistaking those delicate features now fixed in a rictus of agony. Dried blood crusted her naked body in intricate patterns, spirals and glyphs that seemed to writhe before Sarah's stinging eyes. None of it made sense. How could she be both collector and collected, butcher and sheep led oblivious to slaughter? Unless... "Ah, I see a donor." The other Sarah's grin widened, baring teeth in a feral display. "Poor Mildred, so eager to keep our family legacy alive. She was the one who passed you the torch, wasn't she? The key to unlocking the glorious darkness within." Mildred knew. The words tasted like ashes on Sarah's tongue, a noxious coating she longed to scrape away. Aunt Mildred, with her sad, knowing eyes and cryptic final message. Had this been what she'd tried to warn Sarah about, the grim inheritance lurking in their shared blood? Of course she knew, just like her mother knew, and her mother before her, all the way back to Molly Dayton, the first of us to heed the call of the veil, to make the sacrifices needed to keep the old gods fed. Sarah felt her knees buckle, barely catching herself against the doorframe as dizziness threatened to drag her under. It couldn't be true. Her family, a matrilineal line of killers enacting some multi-generational blood pact. Mildred, a willing cog in this machinery of atrocity? But even as revulsion curdled in her gut, some small secret part of her whispered that it made a horrible kind of sense. The nightmares, the waking visions. The inexplicable pull toward morbid fascinations. All her life, she'd felt the darkness singing in her veins, a siren song she'd fought to ignore. As if sensing the path of Sarah's racing thoughts, the doppelganger pressed its advantage. "It's in your blood, Sarah. Our blood, the hunger, the compulsion. You can't fight it any more than you can fight the turning of the seasons or the setting of the sun." "No." The denial tore from Sarah's throat, raw and ragged. She clung to it like a life raft in a churning sea, the only solid ground in a world turned quicksand. "No, that way lies madness. I won't let you twist everything I am." The other Sarah only smiled, a death's head leer. "Oh, my sweet summer child, don't you see? We are all mad here. You can't escape your fate by playing pretend." Lightning quick, it seized Sarah's wrist in an unbreakable grip. Cruel fingers dug into her flesh hard enough to grind bone on bone as it yanked her forward into a grotesque embrace. This close, she had no choice but to meet its eyes, to stare into the bottomless void behind her own stolen face. "Stop fighting, Sarah. Stop trying to be a hero of this story. You know as well as I do that you were never cut out for that role." For a moment, Sarah wavered on the knife's edge. The eager whispers filled her head like a rising flood, promising dark raptures, the ecstasy of surrender. It would be so easy to let go, to sink into the abyss and be consumed. To become one with the beautiful horror her other self represented. But then, blessedly, a flash of movement in the corner of her eye. A pale shape darting through the gap of the open door. Detective Carter. He'd found her, just as he'd promised. Just as some stubborn part of her had never stopped hoping he would. The sight of him was like a dash of icy water, a lifeline thrown to her drowning soul. With a burst of panic strength, Sarah wrenched herself free of the doppelganger's grasp. She staggered backwards, hands raised to ward off its next assault. But the other Sarah just stood there, still smiling that awful smile as Carter's footsteps pounded up the stairs. Sarah, are you in here?" His gruff voice was edged with badly concealed panic. He burst into the room with his gun drawn, his face a mask of pure horror as he took in the scene, the mutilated body on the bed, the eerie play of candlelight over blood-streaked walls. And Sarah at the center of it all, gore staining her hands the deep, damning red of guilt. "No," she whispered, staring at her own tainted flesh, as if seeing it for the first time. When had the lines between vision and reality blurred beyond recognition? "No, Ben, this isn't what it looks like. I wouldn't." But Carter was already advancing on her, his movements stiff and pained, as if it cost him dearly to force out each word. "Sarah Linden, you're under arrest for the murder of Laura Bauer. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law." Sarah barely heard him over the static roaring in her ears. This couldn't be happening. She wanted to scream, to beg, to rail against the utter absurdity of it all. But cold certainty settled in her gut like a stone. It had all been leading to this, hadn't it? The notebook, Mildred's cryptic warnings, her own unraveling mind. She'd been played for a fool, set up to take the fall for crimes that had begun long before she was even born. The collector had won. The truth, when it came, was bitter as wormwood on her tongue. There had never been any other outcome. Numbly, she let Carter lead her out into the waiting night. Away from that terrible room, that terrible revelation of all she was and could ever be. She'd expected the shadows to feel different, somehow, now that she knew their secret. That they housed no external evil, no bogeyman lying in wait. Only the darkness that lived inside them all, the potential for beauty and madness, transcendence and damnation. The darkness that, despite all her desperate efforts, lived inside her too. Had always lived inside her. Sarah lifted her head to the uncaring sky and began to laugh. Chapter 13. Rock Bottom and Shift to Survival. The media circus descended like a pack of rabid hyenas, their jaws snapping with every lurid detail that leaked from Sarah's closed-door confession. Lady Bluebeard, the tabloids screamed in bold, accusing letters that seemed to drip with blood. Best-selling author unveiled as serial killer. Sarah's haunted, hollow-eyed mugshot stared out from dozens of front pages and gossip site screenshots. Her stringy hair hung in lank curtains around a face leached of color, all sharp bones and sunken cheeks. The portrait of a woman unhinged, a monster that had lurked for too long behind a fragile mask of normalcy. And maybe, Sarah thought as she huddled on the narrow cot in her padded cell, knees drawn up to her chest and fingers twitching for a pen they wouldn't let her hold, maybe the jackals were right. God knows she couldn't trust the fractured hall of mirrors that was her own mind anymore. Not since that final, shattering confrontation at the old Blackwood house, that night soaked in blood and revelations that had torn her psyche asunder. The images still swam behind her eyelids in a macabre slideshow every time exhaustion dragged her into a fitful sleep. The body splayed across the rot-pitted floorboards, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. Sarah's own hands tacky and rust-brown with drying blood, her fingerprints pressed into yielding flesh like a perverse signature. And worst of all, rising from the corpse's torn throat in a wheezing death rattle, laughter. The wet, gurgling cackle of a thing that had waited for decades to claw free of its fleshy cage. A shudder rippled through Sarah, and she dug her ragged nails into the goose flesh that pebbled her arms. rocked back and forth in a futile bid for self-comfort, for any sensation beyond the howling static that filled her skull. But the tiny motions just made the springs of the cot squeal in a maddening rhythm, an atonal accompaniment to the caged animal pacing of her thoughts. There wasn't much else to do here, in the white-walled limbo that had swallowed the world she once knew. Just the same 10 square feet of rubberized floor to wear a groove into, the same plastic tray of mush and pills shoved through the reinforced slot in the door. The same waking nightmare playing on repeat every time she made the mistake of letting her mind drift. It had the small mercy, at least, to spare her the horror show of a public trial, to shuffle her swiftly and quietly off to the maximum security wing of the state psychiatric hospital, out of sight and out of mind. The court-appointed shrink took one look at Sarah's babbling, tear-streaked confession and the ragged crescent moons she'd carved into her own palms, and declared her a clear case of criminal insanity. Lost in the labyrinth of persecutory delusions and ancestral demons. This woman has clearly suffered a profound psychotic break, the doctor had told the judge in cool, clinical tones, his pen tapping out a death knell on his clipboard. She requires intensive treatment and supervision, not incarceration. With the proper combination of antipsychotic medication and therapy, it's possible she may one day be able to distinguish reality from her paranoid fantasies. But I emphasize, Your Honor, that day is not today. So here Sarah sat, buried in the bowels of a purgatory reeking of ammonia and despair, preserved in this edgeless, airless amber of fluorescent light and distant, echoing screams, just another artifact of madness gathering dust on an asylum shelf. Some days she wondered if she even existed at all outside the confines of these four walls. If Sarah Linden had ever been more than a mirage, a soap bubble poised to pop at the first brush of a needle, Keen thought. It would be easy, so terribly easy, to sink into the static hum of Thorazine and Haldol, to let the drug sand away the last jagged edges of guilt and grief, smooth her into a pliant doll with a pretty pink smile painted over the cracks. The oblivion of catatonia beckoned with open arms, a siren's song crooning promises of quietus. But every time Sarah closed her eyes, the dead were waiting in the wings of her mind. Their faces flickered in the darkness behind her lids, contorted in silent screams. Mute condemnations that cut deeper than any blade. There was Laura, porcelain skin crazed with inky veins, pearls of blood strung along her throat like some grisly parody of a debutante's choker. Her eyes stared, glassy and fixed, no light left to warm their arctic blue depths. A single accusatory finger thrust out from her mangled hand, its jagged, bitten nail pointing straight at Sarah's heart. And beside her, haloed in a nimbus of ghost light, Mildred. Sarah's lost, murdered muse, her face a death mask of sagging parchment. Disappointment and grief chased themselves across those once haughty features, an infinite feedback loop of sorrow. "Oh, my poor doomed girl," Mildred's specter whispered, the words buzzing with flies. "You should have left the dead to their rest." But worst of all, rising from the writhing shadows like an eldritch queen, the collector, the thing with Sarah's face, now twisted into a mask of cruel, sated jubilation. Gore dripped from its outstretched hands, gathering in viscous pools at its feet. And when it smiled, its teeth glinted like needles in the dark. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Poppet?" The collector's voice oozed into Sarah's skull like quicksilver, cold, and inexorable. "That you could lock me away, bury me in this chemical tomb? Oh, my sweet, stupid girl. I am the marrow in your bones, the maggots writhing in the meat of your gray matter. We are bound, you and I, from first breath to last. And our work, our glorious, terrible work, has only just begun. Every night, those words dragged Sarah shrieking into wakefulness, the screams clawing at her sandpaper throat. She'd thrash against the restraints binding her to the sweat-soaked sheets, fighting to shake the collector's mocking laughter from her head. And there, in the hazy gloom of her cell, shivering in a forgotten corner, she'd see it. A shadow within shadows, long fingers tapping an impenitent rhythm against bony knees. A flash of teeth like bleached bone, eyes that swallowed the light and reflected only endless, gluttonous dark. Her demon, her devil. The twisted mirror self torn from the black beating heart of every ugly impulse Sarah had ever smothered behind a good girl's smile. It wasn't real. Couldn't be real. Just another symptom spat out by her fracturing psyche, a neurochemical glitch in the gray matter. The last tattered shreds of Sarah's rational mind knew that, clung to it like a mantra. But as days melted into weeks, as the drugs chipped away at her already crumbling sense of self, the border between hallucination and flesh grew as thin as a razor's slice. And the collector was always there, crouching in her peripheral vision, waiting, hungering. Was this how it had been for Mildred at the end? Besieged by phantoms, the garrote of generations-old madness tightening around her neck by inches? Had she seen the same visions lurking in the sepia shadows of the old house, heard the same malevolent whispers riding the mold-thick air? Had she struggled against the pull of that poisonous legacy, or had she simply surrendered? Closed her eyes one final time and let death drag her into its fathomless embrace. Sarah didn't know. Couldn't know, through the frenetic kaleidoscope her thoughts had become. But as she sat there, knees drawn up and teeth chattering out a Morse code of despair, something shifted inside her. Some small, stubborn spark guttered to life in the ashes of her heart. She pushed herself upright on the cot, joints popping like twigs, planted her bare feet on the cold tile, and stood, slow and shaky as a newborn foal. In the corner, the collector cocked its head, an avid gleam in its bottomless eyes. Sarah met that void gaze, spine stiff as a ramrod. She stepped forward on trembling legs, hands balled into white-knuckled fists at her sides. "No," she whispered, barely more than a cracked thread of sound. Swallowed hard, tasting blood and bile. Tried again. "No, I won't. I can't let you win, not like this." The collector's lips healed back from its needle teeth in a death's head grin. "Everyone breaks, sweet Sarah, even you." Its voice was the rasp of a rusted blade on bone, insidious and inexorable. "Best to make it easy on yourself. Stop fighting, let go." "Fuck you." Sarah spat the words like bullets, channeling every ounce of defiance left in her blood. "Fuck you, and the pit that spawned you. I'll die before I give you what you want." "Oh, pop it. We both know that isn't true." The collector rose in a sinuous uncoiling of shadow, prowling closer on feet that made no sound against the padded floor. It traced one sharp nail down the gaunt blade of Sarah's cheek, almost tender. "You'll give me everything in the end. Your mind, your heart." A dark chuckle. "Your soul, if you still believe in such antiquated things." Sarah jerked her head away from that obscene touch, lip curling in revulsion. But she held her ground, knees locked against the urge to crumple. "No," she said again, a declaration of war. "I'm still here, you son of a bitch, still breathing, and as long as there's breath in my body, I'll fight you. I'll claw my way back to sanity, and then..." She broke off, chest heaving. Let the next words fall like hammer blows, each one a vow seared into her marrow. And then I will destroy you, rip you out by the roots and grind you to dust beneath my heel. I will break this cycle. For myself and every Linden woman that came before, I don't care if it kills me. A mirthless, jagged smile. I'm already dead. The only question is, what will be left of you when I'm done? For a long, airless moment, the collector stared at her, fathomless gaze stripping Sarah to her component atoms. Then, so slowly it might almost have been a trick of the strobing fluorescence, it began to laugh. A skittering, chittiness sound, the rattle of something long dead and hungry stirring to life. Oh, my darling girl, it purred, dagger teeth flashing. I do so love it when they fight. And as Sarah stood there, trembling with sick rage and something like triumph, she knew the game had changed. The gauntlet thrown, the battle lines drawn in indelible crimson. Let the madness come. Let oblivion gape its maw and monsters cavort in the corners of her mind. Sarah would weather it all, the unimaginable and the unspeakable alike. She would survive this crucible by sheer force of will, and she would emerge tempered by the flames. Stronger. Sharper. Ready to do what must be done, to drive a stake through the heart of the hungry dark that had shadowed her family for so long. Even if it meant she had to carve it from her own chest first. Sarah turned her back on the watching shadow, shoulders set in a rigid line. Settled herself cross-legged on the thin mattress, palms resting open on her knees. Drew in one deep, shuddering breath and began to plan. Sleep could wait. Sanity could wait. She had a war to win. Chapter 14. Turning the Tables. Weeks turned to months in the colorless haze of the hospital. Sarah retreated deep into herself, lost in the labyrinth of her own fractured mind. But not in despair or defeat. No, Sarah's brain buzzed with dark and feverish purpose, a twisted symphony of revenge playing on repeat behind her haunted eyes. Every waking moment was consumed with thoughts of the collector, that phantom menace who had orchestrated her downfall with such cruel precision. The monster who had exploited the Linden family legacy like a puppet master, pulling the strings of madness and murder until Sarah danced helplessly into this cage of sterile white and cloying pity. She stared at the barred windows, the mocking blue sliver of sky beyond, and felt the rage simmer in her veins. If she was truly fated to be the author of this macabre tale, then by God, she would write an ending of her own design. One final twisted plot, with the collector as its sacrificial lamb, served up on an altar of poetic justice. But first she needed to get out of here. Needed to don the mask of sanity with such flawless conviction that even she almost believed it. So Sarah became a model patient, pouring herself into the role with the same manic intensity she once devoted to her novels. She took her meds without complaint, each bitter pill a stepping stone on the path to freedom. She showed up to therapy sessions with a contrite smile and soft, self-reflective words, spinning a tale of trauma and psychological break, of horror novels blurring the line between fantasy and sick compulsion. I got so lost in my own stories, she murmured, eyes downcast, hands twisting in her lap with perfectly calculated remorse. The darkness just swallowed me whole, but I want to get better. I want to make amends. The doctors nodded, scribbling in their notepads, a glimmer of satisfaction in their eyes. Just another tortured artist, led astray by her own demons, but desperate to repent. They'd seen it 1,000 times. And so the dance went on, Sarah painting herself as a woman shattered by her own imagination, but determined to pick up the pieces. Inch by painstaking inch, she regained their trust, all the while choking on the ashes of her pride. But in the privacy of her own skull, in the darkest hours of the night, when the screams of fellow patients echoed down the hallways like a demented lullaby, Sarah planned. She thought of the old Linden cabin, moldering in its shroud of pine and desolation, of the secrets it must hold, breadcrumbs scattered through generations of madness and murder. Secrets she would unearth and weave into a net to ensnare her tormentor. She thought of Detective Carter, with his sad eyes and world-weary cynicism. The only one who had ever truly believed in her, even if that belief had been dashed to jagged pieces in the end. But perhaps there was still an ember of doubt smoldering in the ashes, waiting to be rekindled. An ally to stand at her side when the time came to confront the collector face to face. Most of all, she thought of her phantom twin, the terrible grinning thing that lurked in every shadow, every dark corner of her psyche. Its taunting words echoed in her skull, a perverse challenge and a twisted benediction all at once. "I'm coming for you," Sarah vowed silently, over and over, a blood-soaked prayer to the only God she had left. The God of vengeance, of a reckoning long overdue. "I'm coming, and this time it's you who'll scream, you who'll bleed." At last, after an eternity that seemed to unspool in a fog of medication and too bright fluorescent light, they declared her fit to re-enter society. Or as near to it as Sarah Linden would ever come again, a pariah marked by tragedy and infamy. They gave her a bus ticket, a bottle of pills, and a wan, empty blessing. Made vague noises about halfway houses, support groups, keeping her head down and her nose clean. As if Sarah could ever sink back into the lulling rhythms of a normal life, could ever be more than a ghost drifting through a world that had passed its judgment and found her wanting. But that was all right. She didn't need their platitudes or their pity. All she needed was a purpose, a crusade. A villain to slay, even if that villain wore her own face. Sarah stepped off the bus in the town she'd once tried to call home, a place now steeped in blood and bitter memory. She gazed up at the iron-gray sky, felt the damp breath of the pines on her cheek, and inhaled deep. The chill autumnal air sluiced through her lungs, a cold and bracing benediction, sharp with the tang of coming rain. She was here. She was alive. And she had work to do. Sarah Linden squared her shoulders, wrapped her bony hands tight around the straps of the battered knapsack that held all her worldly possessions. And she began to walk, one foot in front of the other, her cracked leather boots carrying her inexorably forward, toward the bleak and benighted woods that whispered her name like a lover, like a curse. Back to where it had all begun, all those years and murders ago. Back to Mildred's cabin and the reckoning that waited within. She melted into the shadows of the trees, a wraith in human skin, and the gloom swallowed her whole. Chapter 15. The Trap. The cabin seemed to hunker in on itself as Sarah approached, as if bracing for a blow. Like it knew, on some primal level, the violence that was to come. The sickness festering at its rotted core, generations deep. Dead leaves crunched beneath her boots, the only sound in the oppressive hush of the forest. Skeletal branches clawed at a leaden sky, a light fading to a sickly gray. The air smelled of loam and decay, cloying as a funeral shroud. Sarah's breath plumed in the chill, each exhale a fleeting wisp of warmth. She dressed for the occasion in sober blacks and grays, an urban camouflage. The supple jumpsuit hugged her lean frame, like a second skin, the fabric a whisper against her flesh. Clothes for fighting, for flight. A far cry from the billowing skirts and lace collars of the girl she'd once been. At her hip rode a wicked hunting knife, its weight a cold comfort. She thumbed the hilt, muscles remembering the smooth glide of steel from sheath. Remembering the wet, red ruin of flesh parting like ripe fruit beneath the blade's caress. Violence had never been her way. Not before. But this vile place, this foul, fetid mire, it changed a person. Killed them by inches and degrees until only a husk remained. "I know you're here," Sarah said, forcing steel into her voice. It rang hollow in the gloom, muffled by the press of trees. "I can feel you. You ugly son of a bitch, come out and face me." Silence, thick and watchful. The pines leaned closer, greedy for the kill. Sarah waited, muscles coiled tight as watch springs. Waited until she could hear nothing but the thud of her heart, the rush of blood in her ears. And there, at the very edge of perception, a whisper. A sigh borne on the mournful keen of the wind. "Sarah." Soft and sly, full of dark delight. "You came, I knew you would." A movement in the shadows, there and gone again. The impression of limbs, pale as bone. Of eyes, black and fathomless as a shark's. "Couldn't stay away, could you?" A chuckle, obscenely intimate. Not with the game still in play, not with the scent of blood so thick in the air. Sarah's fingers twitched, finding the knife's hilt. "I'm not playing by your rules anymore. This is my story now, my ending to write." "Is it?" The shadows stirred, reform. Became a silhouette, tall and terrible, lounging against the cabin door. "Are you certain you're the author of this tale, and not just another piece on the board, another pawn, moved by a hand you cannot see?" It pushed off the door, sauntered down the steps with a liquid, boneless grace. Feet pale against the mulch of leaves, leaving no imprint. Like something other than human. Something hungry and hollow. "You can't escape what you are, Sarah. What flows in your veins like a sickness, like a curse madness, is mother's milk to our kind." "No." She shook her head, dislodging the cobwebs of doubt. The cloying despair that threatened to smother her, to drown her in the riptide of rage and ruin. "No, I won't accept that. I am more than the sins of my blood." "Are you?" It paused, canting its head in a serpentine gesture. Considering, caressing. "Look at yourself, Sarah, really look, with eyes unclouded by sentiment or self-deception. Standing here in the killing fields, arms and heart steeled for murder, wading in blood up to your elbows and still craving more. You're every inch the monster I am. The only difference is I know my nature." "I know what I am." Sarah drew the knife, the blade whispering free. Starlight danced on its razor edge, a cold and brittle glitter. "I'm a survivor, and I'm done letting you pull my strings." It laughed. "I sound like icicles shattering." "Oh, my darling, you truly believe that, don't you? But I can see the truth shining in your eyes. Hear it in the frantic flutter of your telltale heart. You're one of us, in flesh and spirit, the cruelest cut of all." "Shut up." Sarah lunged, a cry tearing loose from her throat. A banshee wail, a primal shriek of fury and despair. "Shut up, shut up, shut up." The shadows swallowed her whole. And then there was only the brutal crush of bodies, the frenzied slash and tear of the knife. Blood flew in even arcs, pain bloomed bright as dying stars behind her eyes. A red roar filled her head, drowned out all thought, all reason, until there was nothing left but the need to rend and ruin. To kill. But the collector seemed to flow around her blows, a thing made of smoke and malice. It caught her knife hand, forced it down with contemptuous ease, clicked its tongue in mocking reproach as she snarled and struggled. "Don't fight it, sweet girl, don't deny your nature." Its voice in her ear, a sibilant caress. Gentle fingers combing through her sweat-slick hair. Let it free, let it feed. A yawning void opened at Sarah's feet, a chasm with no bottom. An end to guilt, to grief. To the wretched, aching need to be more, be better, be other than the twisted thing she knew lurked behind her breast. It would be easy, so easy, to fall. To open her arms to the abyss and let it take her, make her its own. But no, no. She was Sarah goddamn Linden, and Sarah Linden didn't break. Didn't bend or bow or crawl for any creature, mortal or otherwise. She was stone, she was steel, she was the razor edge between the light and the long dark. And if she was damned to burn, she'd set the world alight on her way down. Sarah reared back, tearing free of the collector's grasp. Staggered 3 steps, chest heaving like a bellows. Raised her head, fixed those empty eyes with her own. Let it see the animal snarl of her smile, the death's head rictus grin. "You want to finish this?" Her voice steady now, strong and cold as iron. The knife blade pressed to her own throat, a lover's kiss. "You want an ending? Come and get it, you ugly son of a bitch." Sarah drew the blade across her skin, a shocking crimson smile. Met the collector's gaze as the blood came, black and steaming in the fading light. Watched it scream, watched it writhe, as the chains of generations shattered link by link. A creature of lies and shadow, undone by the only truth. Death, the great equalizer. The final word in every story ever spun. Sarah felt her legs buckle, felt the cold creep in with velvet fingers. Let her eyes flutter close, a strange and spreading peace pushing back the pain. It was over, all over. She'd won, in the only way that mattered. And as the dark rose up to claim her, the taste of iron thick on her tongue, Sarah Linden laughed. And laughed, and laughed, until the trees shook with it. Chapter 16. The Chase. Blood. So much blood. It sheeted hot and wet down Sarah's front, painting her hands, her shredded jumpsuit. The tang of it coated her tongue, thick and metallic. She could feel it oozing from the gash in her throat, seeping into the fabric clinging to her skin. Every ragged breath sent new rivulets streaming down her neck, pattering to the warped floorboards beneath her feet. Distantly, she could hear the collector howling. A sound of fury and frustrated desire, of sickness thwarted at the moment of its final triumph. It lurched toward her, hands grasping, mouth contorted around jagged teeth turned pink with gore. Meaning to throttle her, to tear her to ribbons, to salvage what it could from this thwarted apotheosis. Its eyes glinted with feral madness in the gloom, pupils blown wide to devour the fading light. But Sarah was already running, hurling herself toward the cabin, toward the facade of false sanctuary, trailing streamers of red in her wake. Each breath was agony, a searing poker through the gash in her throat. She felt light-headed, woozy. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Yet beneath the pain, a giddy thrill unfurled. At the sheer audacity of what she'd done, the impossible turn of tables. Mouse bites cat. Oh, if only Ben could see her now. She hit the weathered door at a dead sprint, shoulders screaming as rotten wood buckled and gave. Moldering pine crumbled around her, scratching exposed skin. She stumbled across the threshold into the gloom, into air gone stale and sour with the reek of old death. Dust motes swirled, stirred to frantic life by her passage. The collector was right on her heels, its sibilant litany of threats and promises dissolving into an enraged shriek. Taloned fingers swiped at Sarah's back, catching at her hair, her collar. Trying to seize her, to haul her backward into its hungry arms. She could feel the heat of its breath, the brush of its lips against her nape as it strained closer. "Sarah," it crooned, voice wet and bubbling. "Don't run, sweet girl. It's time to stop fighting. Time to give in." She whirled, slashing wildly with the knife. A lucky stroke caught her pursuer across the face, opening up a gash from cheek to hairline. Black ichor spurted, hissing where it spattered the floorboards. The acrid stench of it flooded Sarah's nostrils, making her gag. The collector reeled back, maw gaping in mute astonishment. As if it couldn't quite believe the affront, the sheer gall of its quaking quarry daring to strike back. One hand rose to the wound, probed the weeping slash with trembling fingers. "Hurts, doesn't it?" Sarah rasped out. Each word was glass shards in her gullet, lacerating soft tissue already torn and aching. Being on the other end of the blade, the other end of the story. She bared her teeth in a crimson grin, tongue darting out to catch an errant trickle of copper. Let it see her unafraid, reveling in this small victory. This fleeting taste of triumph, however bitter. How's it feel, fucker, to be the mouse and not the cat? The collector screamed, a wordless sound choked with malevolence. Its face contorted, rippling like water disturbed by a cast stone. For a moment, Sarah glimpsed the truth beneath the mask, a roiling chaos of spite and endless hunger, twisted into hateful parody of human features. And then it was coming for her again, a juggernaut of shadow and slaughter. Murder in its eyes and madness dripping from its jaws. Floorboards creaked and popped beneath the weight of its charge, rotted wood straining to contain such focused malice. Sarah fled deeper into the cabin, sending furniture flying with desperate swipes of her free hand. A side table crashed to kindling. Chairs cartwheeled into walls, splintering on impact. Anything to throw obstacles between herself and the thing wearing her face, her fury. Her own personal nemesis, hell-bent on dragging her down into the darkest pit of her psyche. But even as she ran, dodging grasping claws and snapping teeth by bare inches, Sarah could feel herself flagging. Each step was leaden, her limbs moving through an invisible sea of molasses. The gray fog was rising behind her eyes, narrowing her vision to a flickering tunnel. Too much blood. She'd cut too deep, opened the tributary of her own mortality too wide. It was only a matter of time before her reserves ran dry, before she slipped and stumbled and fell headlong into the ungentle dark. Already the shadows pressed close, their edges shimmering with a seductive promise of oblivion. And then the collector would have her, would gore her open and scoop out all her secrets, leave her hollow skin flapping in the foul breeze of its passage. The cycle would continue, the curse carry on. Madness triumphing over reason, sickness over desperate, scrabbling sanity. No, not like this. Please, God, not like this. If Sarah was to die here, bleed out her last onto the warped boards of this benighted place, then let it mean something. Let it purchase an end to this wretched saga once and for all, even if there was no one left to remember her sacrifice. A sudden clarity descended, bright and cool as a fall of snow. Pain and exhaustion fell away, subsumed by crystal purpose. And Sarah knew what she had to do. The only way to win this game, this war. The only path to a true and lasting victory. She just prayed she had the strength to see it through. Chapter 17. The Final Confrontation. Sarah burst into the cabin's main room, her heart pounding a frenzied tattoo against her ribs. The space was dominated by a monstrous stone fireplace, a hulking presence that seemed to swallow the dim light filtering through the grime-encrusted windows. The hearthstones were stained, soot-blackened, bearing silent witness to decades of neglect. Dry leaves skittered across the rough-hewn floorboards, mingling with the scattered bones of small animals long since claimed by time and decay. The air hung thick with the reek of mold, of secrets left too long to fester in the dark. Behind her, Sarah could hear the collector crashing through the halls, its heavy tread shaking the walls, rattling the threadbare remains of her sanity. It was howling its fury, its twisted adoration, a hellish choir that set her teeth on edge and sent icy tendrils of fear snaking down her spine. She could feel the weight of its hunger, the sickening intensity of its desire to catch her, consume her, cherish her, in the only way such a wretched thing could comprehend. Sarah skidded to a halt in the center of the room, spinning to face the monster that dogged her heels. Her muscles burned with the strain of too many miles, too many months spent running from the nightmare snapping at her heels. But no more. She planted her feet wide, the knife clutched in one trembling fist, and lifted her chin in blood-stained defiance. Gore matted her hair, painting gruesome stripes across her ashen face, her teeth a vulgar red in the gloom. "Come on then," she rasped out, her voice a sandpaper rasp in her raw throat. She jerked her head at the cold and waiting fireplace, a cenotaph of cobwebs and crumbling mortar. "Come and get me, you miserable son of a bitch, I'm done running." The collector slowed, stopped. It stood swaying in the doorway, its head cocked like a raptor sighting wounded prey. Black blood dripped from its ravaged cheek, a viscous ooze that spattered the floor in obscene Rorschach patterns. Its eyes were fathomless pits in its ruined face, twin voids that pulled at the tattered edges of Sarah's resolve. For a long, stretching moment it simply stared, drinking in the sight of her poised and ready. A dark Madonna, drenched in her own vital fluids, blazing with a desperate, defiant ferocity. Something worshipful, reverential, flickered behind its empty gaze. A twisted parody of adoration, of obsession, refined into purest madness. And then its smile, a slash of white in the shadows. Its tongue darted out to lap at the viscous ichor painting its chin, savoring the taste of her terror, her rage. It took a slinking step forward, bare feet slapping wetly on the floorboards. "Clever girl," it purred, its voice a grating rasp that set Sarah's teeth on edge. "Clever, clever creature, you found your teeth at last, haven't you? Found the beast inside, the killer under the skin." It prowled closer, a nightmare thing made flesh. Ropes of drool swung from its jagged maw, spattering the floor in Rorschach smears of mingled red and black. Sarah's gorge rose, her stomach clenching in revulsion. But she held her ground, refusing to give even an inch to the monster wearing her face, her pain. "Do it then, Sarah mine," it crooned, its fetid breath washing over her in a putrid wave. "Embrace your birthright, your legacy, cut the tether binding you to mortal qualms, to paltry human frailty, become the beautiful monster you were always meant to be." Sarah swallowed hard, the gulf of her cut throat rippling. She could taste the hot salt sting of her own mortality on her tongue, the metal and marrow taint of approaching death. But beneath the fear, beneath the soul-deep revulsion, something fierce and feral stirred in her breast. A flame long banked, now kindled to roaring life. "I'm not your anything," she whispered, the words ringing with quiet conviction. She took a measured step back toward the fireplace's looming maw. The rough stone was cold against her spine, an anchor tethering her to the last shreds of herself. "I never was. I'm Sarah goddamn Linden, and my story is my own." Another step, the knife never wavering. Sarah felt the chill of the hearthstones leaching through her jacket, through skin and sinew to wrap around the cage of her ribs. She welcomed the cold, the clarity of it. Let it wash through her like a purifying tide, sluicing away the clinging cobwebs of doubt and despair. "Maybe you're right," she said, and there was a wondering note in her voice, threaded through with razor wire. "Maybe madness is in my blood, my bones. Maybe I was damned from the first moment I drew breath." A laugh bubbled up her ragged throat, crazed and incredulous. "But I'll be damned on my terms, not yours, my life, my death, my choice." The collector hissed like a tea kettle, a shriek of outraged negation. It lunged forward, clawed fingers grasping, meaning to seize her, rend her, to make this defiant creature her own, a trophy of twisted flesh and shattered will. Sarah met its charge with a savage cry of her own, a banshee wail that shook the rotting rafters. She crashed into the nightmare wearing her face, her pain, with all the strength of her failing flesh. All the wild, reckless fury of a woman with nothing left to lose. They rolled across the floor in a macabre tangle of limbs, a perversion of lover's knot. Snarling, clawing, each seeking to bury their teeth in the other's throat. To tear and rend and break, until only one was left standing in the crimson ruin. The knife traded hands once, twice, in a frenzied blur of silver. It sank into yielding flesh, skated off bone with a sickening scrape. Sarah screamed as talons sank into the meat of her belly, raked furrows in the bleeding wreck of her shoulder. But still she fought, with every last shred of her stubborn will. Pummeling, gouging, slamming her head into the collector's ravaged face again and again. Until her vision sparked white at the edges and the world spun like a demented carousel. In the end, it was as much luck as skill that saved her. A serendipitous twist of straining bodies, a desperate, wrenching heave. And suddenly Sarah was on top, the monster pinned beneath her greater weight. The knife buried to the hilt in its chest, black ichor bubbling up around the blade in obscene spurts. For a long, suspended moment, the two simply stared at each other. Light and shadow, mirror images cracked and flawed. Frankenstein and her monster, maker and maid, twined together in a parody of maternal embrace. Sarah gazed into the collector's fading eyes, and at last saw herself reflected back. Not a mewling victim or a slavering beast, but a woman. Battered and bloody, the tattered moth wings of her psyche held together by spit and prayers and sheer stubborn will. But still, somehow, impossibly, unbroken. Unbowed. Human in all its awful glory. Its desperate, defiant need to survive, to endure. to rage against the dying of the light, with every last scrap of strength in its fragile cage of bone and meat. "It's over," she told her doppelganger, her personal demon, her twisted twin. "You're done, we're done, this story ends here." The thing beneath her butt writhed, tried to throw her off, to sink its fangs into the meat of her just one last time. But Sarah held fast, an immovable object against its unstoppable force. She would not be displaced, not now, not ever again. And slowly, by brutal inches, the collector stilled. The unholy light in its eyes flickered, guttered out like a blown candle. Its limbs fell slack, its breath rattling to a stop in its ruined chest. Dead. It was dead and gone, and Sarah was still here, breathing, bleeding, alive against all odds and reason. She climbed slowly to her feet, every sinew screaming a protest. Stood swaying over her fallen foe, her conquered self, as the gray fog of shock and fatigue pressed in at the edges of her vision. "I win," she rasped out to the watching shadows, to the ghosts and specters that clung to the edges of this blighted place, this sepulcher of secrets and lies. "Do you hear me, you rotten bastard? I fucking win." And Sarah turned on her heel and walked out of that foul cabin, out into the cool embrace of the night, the suzerain whisper of the pines. She had just enough left in her to stagger to the road, to flag down a passing car, to rasp out a desperate plea for help, for salvation, before the waiting dark rose up and swallowed her whole. But as she slipped into the welcome oblivion of unconsciousness, as the world fell away, Sarah knew that it would spit her out again, that she would wake and heal and live to fight another day. Because she was the hero of this story and the author of her fate, the monster and the savior, the darkness and the light. And her tale was not yet done. Not by a long shot. Chapter 18. Ambiguous Victory. There were questions, of course. When the ambulance delivered Sarah to the hospital, her veins muddied with opiates and her throat a red ruin. When the police found the blood-soaked cabin, the shattered furnishings, the swaths of gore painted across walls and floors like a mad expressionist mural. They tried to piece it together. The little girl lost, the prodigal daughter. Back from the dead and the damned, trailing mystery and murder in her wake. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness as the paramedics rushed her through the ER doors, the wail of sirens and strobing lights fading into a morphine haze. Snippets of frantic voices swirled around her of multiple lacerations, severe blood loss, possible psychotic break. The words buzzed like flies, meaningless and maddening. In the rare moments of lucidity between surgeries and heavy sedation, Sarah tried to explain through a ravaged voice box held together with stitches and prayers. About Mildred's journal, the cycle of atrocities spelled out in its crumbling pages. The collector's grinning shadow that had haunted her, the grins of plague seated in the roots of her family tree. Some of the detectives listened solemnly and took careful notes, pity and horror warring in their eyes as she recounted her battle with a monster generations in the making. They made vague assurances that she was safe now, honeyed words that rang hollow in the bleak light of day. That it was over, that she could begin to mend, to rebuild herself from the ground up. But not all were so easily convinced. Their faces swam above Sarah in her narcotic stupor, lip curled in professional skepticism. Muttering clinical terms cloaked in false sympathy, fugue state, paranoid delusions, inability to cope with grief and guilt. They thought her broken beyond repair, a shattered doll raving about her own demons. Sarah let their theories wash over her, too weary, and run out to care what box they wanted to put her in. Brave survivor or fractured shell, avenging angel or delusional villain. She'd carved those roles herself, wielded them like a weapon and shield against the hungry dark. They could call it what they liked. She knew the truth, paid for it with blood and madness and the endless screaming nightmares. The doctors poked and prodded, eased her through the brutal process of knitting bone and flesh, of unchaining her mind from ceaseless horror. They prescribed therapy in pills, platitudes, and plastic smiles. Shook their heads at the wreckage of her body, as if it was her pain they could read in the puckered scars and trembling hands. In time, Sarah tuned them out too. Let their chatter fade to a distant buzz as she retreated deep inside herself, to the small, still voice that had seen her through the long dark. That had guided her hand and steadied her mind as she waged war against an enemy with no face, no form. An enemy that wore her skin, her history. That grinned out at her from the pages of Mildred's journal, a twisted reflection spilled in ink and agony. It was that voice that held her now, as the hospital walls pressed close and the days bled together. That reminded her with every struggling breath that she was alive, against all odds and evils. Damaged beyond measure, perhaps, a shattered stained glass saint. But here and whole, the collector's curse broken on the wheel of her will. When they finally let her go, Sarah knew there was one more bridge to burn, one more act to close the curtain on this brutal drama. She signed the discharge papers with a hand that shook only slightly, claimed the crutches and pain pills they thrust at her with grim determination. Let her aunt's old truck carry her up the winding forest road, to the cabin that crouched like a spider in its web of yellowing police tape. The windows stared at her, black and inscrutable in the one autumn light. Accusing, damning, as if the house itself was an accessory to all the wrongs done within it, all the lives and hopes devoured by the beast that slumbered in Sarah's bones. She didn't go inside. Couldn't bear to step across that blighted threshold, to breathe the musty air gone rancid with death and deceit. To see the ruin of her illusions, the tattered remains of the woman she thought she could become in this peaceful place. Instead, Sarah stood in the tall weeds of the yard, looking up at the weathered boards and bowed roof, at the stones of the chimney, fuzzed green with lichen and choked by kudzu. The trees towered over her, their leaves a patchwork of decay, skeletal branches reaching for a colorless sky. So much suffering, seeping from the very earth, the residue of stolen lives and splintered minds, of generations caught in the collector's web. Mildred had sensed it, had tried in her way to prepare Sarah for the battle ahead, to give her the weapons she would need to cut the curse off at the root, to end the line of tragedy stitched into their DNA. Not that it had saved her in the end, or any of the women who came before. They'd all fallen into the abyss, one by one, fodder for the thing that had no name. The void that prowled behind their eyes and lurked in their dreams, implacable and eternal. Sarah drew in a breath, let it out slow. No more. It ended here with her. No more daughters lost, no more secrets like poison in the well. She would break the cycle, bring the whole rotted edifice down on its own foundation. She raised her hands, turned her ravaged face to the iron sky. Closed her eyes, reaching for the fire that had always smoldered in her core, banked to embers by pain and drugs. Burn, she whispered, a prayer and a curse, an immolation, seared with the force of her rage, her hard-won triumph. Burn and be done, you wretched thing. Let the flames eat your lies, purify this place of its filth. And slowly, incredibly, A curl of smoke rose from the cabin's mossy roof. Licked at the brittle shingles, the curling edges of the police tape. Caught and spread, a blossom of destruction hungry for tinder. The logs charred, caved inward with a groan of tortured wood. Sparks swirled, ash and cinder drifting in macabre snow, blanketing the yard, the forest, the whole of Sarah's fractured world. She stood as the hungry flames roared, singeing her hair and bringing involuntary tears to her eyes. Watched her inheritance collapse, the physical symbol of all her family's depravity and despair crumbling to embers. Mildred's kingdom, the collector's garden, all fuel for this last bonfire, this pyre at the crossroads where past and future burned together. When there was nothing left but smoke and ruin, Sarah exhaled a final time. Let her arms fall to her sides, her chin dropped to her chest. A puppet with cut strings, a effigy with nothing left to give. She backed away from the smoldering wreckage, step by stumbling step, until the trees swallowed her once more. It was over. The story ended, the curse undone. The collector banished to smoke and memory, no longer a devil on her shoulder or a shadow in the mirror. Sarah Linden, broken but unbowed, limped off into the waiting woods. Into a future uncertain and uncharted, free from the sins of her forebears at last. A survivor. A victor. An author, penning her own epilogue in the annals of the lost and the found. Chapter 19. Uncertain Aftermath. The road forward was not an easy one. Sarah carried her scars, both physical and emotional, like a penitent's garb. Like a hair shirt, forever abrading the raw places of her psyche. She tried to lose herself at first, to sink into the anonymity of a wanderer's existence, drifting from town to town like a ghost, ephemeral and untethered. She took odd jobs to keep herself afloat, waitressing, bartending, even a brief stint as a night janitor at a grungy motel. The kind of place where the mirrors were cracked and cloudy, the thin walls barely muffling the sounds of furtive coupling and drunken arguments. Sarah drank to keep the nightmares at bay, sinking into the blurred oblivion of cheap whiskey. But the alcohol was a fickle mistress, granting temporary respite while exacting its own insidious toll. She would jolt awake in the pallid light of dawn, head pounding and mouth tasting of ashes, fragments of distorted memory flitting behind her eyelids like the flap of bat wings. Always, always, the past nipped at her heels. It caught her in unguarded moments, the glimpse of her haggard reflection in a grimy mirror, all bruised shadows and hollow cheeks. The silhouette of a stranger in a darkened alley, a flash of fair hair disappearing around a corner that made her heart stutter and race. Was it real, that flicker of recognition? That frisson of the uncanny, hairs rising on the nape of her neck like the brush of ghostly fingers? Or just the tattered remnants of her paranoia, the shreds of madness clinging to the undersides of her skin like stubborn cobwebs? Sarah didn't know, couldn't be sure. The rational part of her brain insisted it was just her mind playing tricks, the trauma asserting itself in new and inventive ways. But deep down, in some primal place that knew the taste of blood and the snap of bone, she wondered. It gnawed at her, that uncertainty. Kept her up at night, staring at nicotine-stained ceilings and listening to the scratch of tiny claws in the walls. Because if she was wrong, if her twisted twin had somehow survived their final confrontation. No. She couldn't think like that, couldn't let the insidious tendrils of doubt take root. The collector was dead, ashes on the indifferent wind. Sarah had made damn sure of that, had felt the life leave the tainted husk with her own two hands. Its hold on her was broken, its curse lifted. But still the question haunted her, an itch she couldn't scratch. An emptiness, yawning at the core of her like a black hole, devouring light and warmth and hope. As if in killing that thing, that pale imitation, she'd carved out some vital part of herself. Left a hole, ragged, edged, and weeping, that could never fully be filled. Who was she, in the wake of all that savagery? What was left of the woman she'd been, the self that had died and been reborn in the crucible of that final, fateful confrontation? A survivor, certainly. A fighter, clawing her way back from the brink of annihilation through sheer grit and bloody-minded will. But also a killer. A monster steeped in atrocity, the sickness and sin of her foremothers, the taint that had sunk its hooks into the linden line and refused to let go. Could she ever truly outrun that legacy, that stain on her soul? Or would it follow her all her days, a shadow cast by the guttering light of her desperate, defiant humanity? In the end, as with so much else, only time would tell. Sarah kept moving, kept putting one foot in front of the other, even when each step felt like wading through knee-deep sand. Kept breathing, the rise and fall of her lungs an act of rebellion against the void that hungered for her. Kept fighting, though some days it was all she could do to drag herself out of bed and into the harsh light of day. And she wrote. God, how she wrote, the words pouring out of her in a torrent, a flood, as if the dam of her long silence had finally cracked and given way. She filled notebook after notebook, bleeding her anguish and rage onto the pages in stark slashes of ink, purging the poison, exorcising the demons that gibbered in her head, that rattled the bars of the cage she'd made of her bones. She wrote about Mildred, the woman whose madness had set the gears of tragedy in motion. About the journal and its litany of murders stretching back through the decades, an unbroken chain of blood and suffering. About the generations of Linden women, lost and devoured, their screams echoing down through the years. She wrote about the collector, the twisted thing that had worn her face like an ill-fitting mask. The distorted mirror image, the dark reflection that had stalked her steps and haunted her dreams. The final girl and the monster, locked in a mortal struggle for the very essence of her being. And she wrote about herself, Sarah Linden, the unlikely hero of this grim fairy tale. The survivor, the victor, battered and scarred but unbroken. The author of her own story at long last, wresting narrative agency back from the greedy clutches of fate. It was not a happy ending, neat and tidy and tied up with a bow. There was too much blood for that, too many scars etched deep into the fabric of her psyche. Too many pieces of herself lost along the way, shards of a shattered soul never to be fully mended. But it was an ending and a beginning. A chance to start anew, to build something from the ashes of her ruined past. To find meaning, and maybe someday, even a measure of peace in the sharing of her hard-won truths. Sarah would seize that chance and hold fast, cling to it with every ounce of her hard, forged strength. She would walk forward into the unknown, head unbowed, and meet whatever waited on the other side. And maybe, just maybe, she would find her way back to the light. To a self untainted by darkness, a heart tempered by the fires of all she had endured. A woman, flawed and fractured, but free at last to shape her own reality. To be the hero of her own tale, come what may in hell to pay. She squared her shoulders, lifted her chin, and took that first trembling step into the waiting dawn. Chapter 20. Conclusion. In the end, Sarah Linden did the only thing she could do. She lived. Day by day, hour by hour, putting the jagged pieces of herself back together, one agonizing smithereen at a time. It was a grueling process, not for the faint of heart. There were good days when the sun streamed through her cabin windows and her pen flew across the pages, the words pouring out of her in a cleansing torrent. On those days, Sarah almost felt whole again, almost human. She'd brew a strong cup of coffee and sit out on the porch, breathing in the crisp mountain air, watching the wind rustle through the towering pines. For a few blissful moments, the darkness would recede, held at bay by the simple beauty of the world around her. But the bad days always return, as inescapable as the turning of the earth. Days when the mere act of rising from bed felt like an impossible task, when the ghosts of her past pressed in close, their icy fingers clutching at her heart. The memories would come flooding back in vivid flashes, the blood, the brutality, the mind-numbing horror of it all. Sarah's hands would shake, her breath coming in ragged gasps as the abyss yawned open before her, threatening to drag her back down into its pitiless depths. On those days, Sarah had to fight for every inch, every scrap of herself. She'd stagger to her writing desk on leaden feet, force her trembling fingers to pick up the pen. And then she'd write, pouring the poison from her veins in a torrent of searing words, exorcising the demons, the twisted specters of her family's sins. It was a battle fought in fits and starts, in tears and in fury, but always, Sarah clawed her way back to the light. Inch by painstaking inch, word by hard-won word. She'd remind herself of how far she'd come, of the stubborn spark of humanity still flickering inside her, the ember of resilience that refused to gut her out. When the book was finally finished, it was a raw and unflinching thing, a chronicle of madness and monstrosity laid bare in stark black and white. Sarah had ripped open the darkest chapters of the Linden family history and bled them onto the page, sparing no gory detail. The murders, the depravity, the sickness that had sunk its teeth into her bloodline and refused to let go, it was all there, a testament to the abyss that had spawned her. But amidst the horror, there was also hope, a fragile thread of light winding through the darkness. Because Sarah's book was more than just a catalog of atrocities. It was a story of survival against impossible odds, of the unbreakable human spirit, the sheer tenacity that could endure any hell and still claw its way back to the light. With every page, every painful truth wrested from the shadows, Sarah had reinforced that essential core of herself, the part that refused to surrender, to let the darkness win. She called it The Collector, a title that captured the duality of her tale, the legacy of evil she'd inherited, and the simple defiant act of reclaiming her own story. As Sarah hefted the manuscript in her hands, feeling the weight of the words that had cost her so much, a sense of quiet triumph bloomed in her chest. The book might be a tough sell in a world that preferred its monsters safely confined to the realm of fiction, but that didn't matter, not really. What mattered was that she'd done it, effaced down her demons and demanded the truth, no matter how ugly or painful. A smile tugged at the corners of Sarah's mouth as she tucked the manuscript under her arm, a small, secret thing like a hidden weapon. She stepped out into the morning light, breathing deep the scent of pine and petrichor. The shadows of her past seemed to recede with every step, loosening their chokehold on her heart. Sarah Linden, the final girl, the survivor, the author of her own story, mistress of her own fate. She was battle-scarred and weary to the bone, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt a flicker of something that might have been peace. Not the gentle, easy kind that came from a life untouched by darkness, but something fiercer, more enduring. The peace of a woman who'd walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged on the other side, bloodied but unbroken, tempered in the crucible of her own worst nightmares. As Sarah made her way down the cabin steps and onto the winding forest path, she could feel the weight of the future stretching out before her, unwritten and unknown, brimming with untold possibilities. She would carry her scars with her always. That much was certain. But she would also carry the knowledge of her own strength, her own unvanquished spirit. Whatever trials lay ahead, whatever fresh hells the world had in store, Sarah knew she would face them as she had every other demon, with gritted teeth and blazing eyes, with the heart of a woman who refused to stay in the shadows. Sarah Linden walked out of the dark and twisted labyrinth of her past and into the light of a new dawn. Battered and bruised, but standing tall. Unbroken. Unvanquished. Free. The end.